Hello family. Before the video starts, I need your support from the heart. The channel has been struggling with views and engagement lately, and it's been hard to keep going. If you're watching, one like and one comment can truly make a big difference and help this video reach more people. Thank you for being here with me. And now, let's begin. I accepted the position at Yellowstone because I was running from something, though I didn't admit that to the hiring panel. The official reason was simpler. After 8 years managing trails at Grand Teton, I wanted the challenge of backcountry patrol in America's oldest national park. That was true enough. What I didn't mention was the silence that had consumed my marriage, the way my ex-wife stopped looking at me somewhere between year 6 and 7, the particular shade of exhaustion that comes from pretending normalcy while everything underneath erodes. The National Park Service doesn't ask uncomfortable questions during interviews. They want capable people willing to spend months in isolation, and there's an understood agreement that you don't probe too deeply into motivations. My 20-year background in wilderness management, my excellent safety record, my certifications in wilderness medicine and advanced emergency response, these were the credentials they cared about. The fact that I needed to disappear into something vast and indifferent was mine to manage. They assigned me to the Biscuit Basin District in early September after the summer rush had thinned and the park exhaled into its quieter season. My territory encompassed roughly 90,000 acres of thermal features, forest, and backcountry. Most rangers handle this with radio support and regular contact with ranger stations. I requested minimal check-ins. My supervisor, a competent woman named Rebecca who'd been with the service for 20 years, approved it without comment. She understood the type. The cabin sat 7 miles from the nearest maintained trail, positioned between Biscuit Basin proper and a smaller thermal area locals called the Threshold, a cluster of geothermal features that didn't make the official maps. It had been a research station in the 1970s before the park reorganized resources. The structure was solid, 800 square feet, wood frame, a working kitchen, a generator that ran when maintained, and a water system fed from a nearby spring. A lake, Merlin Lake, though only a handful of people knew that name, lay 3 miles north through Lodgepole Forest. The first weeks passed in the rhythm of routine. I opened trails, cleared deadfall, checked bear canisters at backcountry sites, and filed reports that no one read with particular attention. The solitude was immense and genuine, the kind of quiet that comes when you're far enough from human noise that the natural world fills the absence completely. Elk migrations began in late September. I watched herds move through the valleys at dawn, their calls echoing across the thermal basins. Snow came early that year, unusual for September, retreating almost entirely by early October. October was when things became strange. The cabin's previous occupants had left it in decent condition, though I found something unusual in the basement storage area. A journal, leather-bound, with entries dating back to 1987. The handwriting belonged to someone named Marcus, a researcher studying geothermal microbiology. Most entries were technical observations, thermal pool temperatures and mineral compositions, but the later entries, from August and September of that year, shifted in tone. August 14. Unusual activity at the secondary thermal sites. Witnessed what appeared to be a large mammal moving through the thermal area at night. Fur color consistent with grizzly, but the movement pattern was unlike any bear behavior I've documented. Bipedal locomotion observed for extended periods. Likely misidentification, but worth noting. August 28. Heard vocalizations tonight that were not typical of park fauna. The sound began as a low-frequency hum, then shifted to something resembling human speech, but distorted. Duration approximately 4 minutes. No visible source. Reviewed bear vocalizations and large canine recordings. No match. Recorded audio on magnetic tape. Will compare to wildlife database. September 3. Found prints near the threshold today. Impression is humanoid in basic structure, but the foot is too large and the spacing suggests a different biomechanics than human walking. Measurement 17 inches in length, unusual toe spacing. The impression suggests weight distribution on the outer edge of the foot, inconsistent with human physiology. Cannot determine species. Plaster cast created for future reference. Growing concerned about methodology, seeing patterns that may not exist due to isolation stress. September 9. Abandoned the secondary monitoring tonight. Something was moving through the thermal basins during observations. I could hear it circling the equipment, but visibility was poor. Thermal vents were obscuring sightlines. The breathing pattern was extremely heavy, almost labored, and the smell was overwhelming. A mixture of animal musk and something else I cannot identify. The air quality in my nasal passages burned. I left the equipment and returned to the cabin, locking doors. This is not professional. Will resume tomorrow during daylight. September 12. Leaving tomorrow. Cannot stay longer. What I thought were multiple creatures visiting the thermal area may be one animal with unusual behavioral patterns, or it may be something else entirely. The night sounds have become more deliberate, almost probing. At 2:47 a.m., something moved across the cabin roof. The weight distribution suggests a large mammal, but the movement was too controlled, too aware. I felt observed. This is not rational, but I am not staying to verify. The entries ended there. I read the journal during the second week of October, sitting at the cabin's main table with coffee growing cold in my hands. My instinct was to dismiss it as the documentation of someone suffering from isolation-induced paranoia, a well-documented phenomenon in remote research positions. Extended solitude without human interaction produces predictable psychological effects: hypervigilance, pattern recognition in random events, the tendency to interpret ambiguous stimuli as threatening. Marcus had stayed for 6 weeks. The mind breaks differently when you're alone. Yet I found myself reading it again that evening, and again the next morning. The lake was my escape. I established a routine of hiking out 3 mornings a week, a 9-mile round trip through varying terrain. The path descended gradually from the cabin, moving through dense lodgepole forest, then emerging into an area where an old fire had cleared the trees a decade earlier. New growth had returned, aspen and younger conifers creating a middle story. The forest at Merlin Lake was mixed, Douglas fir, spruce and larch creating a canopy that filtered light into scattered patterns. The lake itself was modest, perhaps a mile long and half that wide. The water was exceptionally clear, the bottom visible to depths of 40 feet in some areas. In early October, the fall colors reflected in that clarity created something beautiful and slightly unreal. Golden larches transformed to mirror images on the surface. The few remaining clouds moved across inverted sky. I would sit at the water's edge for hours, sometimes fishing without any expectation of catching anything, more often simply existing in the space. The act of reading Marcus's journal and then choosing to return to the forest felt like testing something in myself. Some need to verify that the rational world remained rational, that forests stayed forests, that absence of logical explanation didn't necessitate acceptance of impossible ones. October 15th was when I found the first set of prints. They were on the eastern shore of the lake, in a sandy area where water lapped softly during calm periods. The prints were large. I measured them at 19 inches, with 5 toes. The structure was wrong, though I couldn't articulate precisely what I meant by that. A bear's print is distinctive. You cannot mistake it for anything else. A human print is equally unmistakable. These prints were organized somewhere between those categories, as if something had attempted to replicate a human footprint without fully understanding the anatomy. The spacing suggested a bipedal gait, but the weight distribution was odd. The outer edge of the foot bore more of the impression than the inner surface. The toes were longer than human proportions with uneven spacing. I photographed them with my phone, took measurements, noted the exact location. The prints extended from the water's edge back into the forest for approximately 20 feet, then stopped abruptly. There was no pattern of other prints returning, just a termination point, as if the creature had simply ceased leaving impressions. I didn't call Rebecca. I told myself the photos were unclear and the prints were likely from a black bear with some unusual paw structure or gait. But I knew, in that specific way knowledge arrives sometimes without ceremony, that I was lying to myself. I'd worked in wilderness for 2 decades. I understood the vocabulary of animal signs. These prints were not in my vocabulary. That night I locked the cabin doors and windows. This was unnecessary. I never locked them. Bears cannot turn doorknobs and human intruders were statistically less likely than strike by lightning in remote areas. I locked them anyway. Sleep was difficult. The cabin sounds, settling wood, the generator's rhythm, wind through the chimney, became coordinates for my attention. Every creak mapped itself onto my mental space. I lay awake waiting for something, though I couldn't articulate what. Around 2 a.m., I heard movement on the cabin's roof, weight traversing from the eastern side toward the chimney. Slow, deliberate movement, not wind-blown debris or an animal passing through. The movement suggested intention, exploration. I rose and positioned myself near the window, though I didn't look outside. Looking felt dangerous, as if visibility might be bilateral, that observing something might obligate it to respond. The movement continued for approximately 3 minutes, then ceased. I didn't return to bed. The next morning, I examined the roof from the ground. No visible marks, no damaged shingles, no evidence of anything substantial having crossed the surface. The gutters showed no signs of disturbance. There was nothing to confirm what I'd heard, which somehow made the memory stronger rather than weaker. I could not dismiss it as dream, but the absence of physical evidence prevented confirmation. October 17th brought lost hikers, a couple, probably mid-60s, who'd underestimated the distance between trailheads and overestimated their fitness level. I found them at the intersection of two poorly marked routes, the woman sitting while the man paced. They'd been missing since the previous afternoon. Their names were Richard and Jennifer. They were from Ohio, had planned a moderate day hike, and had become disoriented when a trail marker was obscured by recent deadfall. This was routine. I radioed their location to base, assessed their physical condition, provided water and high-calorie food, and guided them out via the most direct route. It took 4 hours. By the time I delivered them to the ranger station, they were grateful, tired, and somewhat embarrassed. Richard apologized repeatedly. Jennifer simply looked relieved. They represented the expected pattern of wilderness engagement, human error, capable intervention, reasonable resolution, but something had shifted in the forest during those 4 hours. I noticed it on the return hike to the cabin. The animal sounds had changed. The ravens and jays that typically call throughout the day were silent. Elk that usually bugle in late afternoon were absent. The forest was quiet in a way that suggested no wildlife, rather than the normal quiet of animals' regular movements. There was a smell too, faint but present, not unpleasant but unfamiliar, something organic but not consistent with any animal I could identify. Musk-like, but with a mineral quality underneath, as if the creature produced something that incorporated chemicals from the thermal areas. I reached the cabin as light was failing and immediately confirmed that the structure was undisturbed. No broken windows, no signs of entry, yet something felt off about the interior. The air was different, not contaminated, but stale in a particular way, as if it had been exhaled and reabsorbed multiple times. I checked the basement storage where I'd found Marcus's journal. Everything appeared exactly as I'd left it. The journal itself was on the shelf where I'd placed it, but when I picked it up, I knew someone else had handled it. The weight distribution was slightly different in how I expected it to feel, and the pages had shifted minutely. Someone had read it, or attempted to, during my absence. This was the point where rational thought became difficult to maintain. I sat at the kitchen table and constructed the most logical explanation. I'd been alone too long. Marcus's journal had primed me toward believing in patterns. The prints at the lake could be bear paw prints distorted by water erosion or my own perceptual bias. The sounds on the cabin roof were wind-related phenomena. The feeling of the journal being handled was false memory or displacement. I'd moved it and forgotten. The animal sounds in the forest had a dozen innocent explanations: migration patterns, weather systems, routine variations in daily behavior. The explanation was sound. It was not convincing. By October 20th, I'd documented 7 additional sets of large prints. These were distributed across different locations in my territory. 2 sets at the thermal areas near the cabin, 1 set on the trail toward Biscuit Basin, 3 sets at different locations around Merlin Lake, and 1 set that I almost missed near the stream that fed my water system. This final set was the closest to the cabin, approximately 40 yards away. The prints were clear and fresh, made within hours of my discovery. I still hadn't called anyone. Part of this was the recognition that calling would require explanation. How would I articulate this to Rebecca? We need to conduct a field study of large prints that don't match known species. The Park Service would send someone to investigate, find nothing definitive, and note in my file that I was developing isolation-related issues. My career would enter a slow decline, nothing overt, but subtle diminishments. Fewer preferred assignments, more skeptical reviews, eventual suggestions that I might consider other employment. But there was another reason I didn't call. Part of me wanted to understand what this was. Not in an academic sense, though that would have been acceptable reasoning. In a deeper sense, the same need that had driven me to accept this position in the first place. A need to be present with something real and unexplainable. Something that could not be rationalized or processed into neat categories. The prints suggested a large primate. The anatomy was consistent with bipedal locomotion, though the feet were not configured for human walking. The size and spacing suggested a creature weighing somewhere between 300 and 400 pounds, given the depth of impression in various soil conditions. The prince traveled certain routes repeatedly: the shore of Merlin Lake, the thermal areas, the forest near my cabin. The creature had patterns, territories, and possibly routines. On October 23rd, I found the first gift. It was placed on the cabin's front step, positioned carefully in the center of the porch. A mule deer front leg cleanly separated at the shoulder joint. The animal was recent killed, the blood still fresh enough to be tacky. But what struck me was the precision of the separation. The joint had been severed with knowledge of anatomy, not simply torn apart. Predatory damage from bears or wolves produces a different pattern: multiple lacerations, irregular separations, evidence of struggle. This was surgical in its precision. I stared at it for a very long time, unwilling to process what its presence meant. The gift was a communication. That was the only interpretation available. Gifts left at a human dwelling, especially when placed rather than scattered, represent intent. They represent a mind making choices about interaction. They represent recognition of me as a separate entity worthy of acknowledgement. I photographed the leg from multiple angles. I documented the precise placement. Then I placed it in a bag, sealed it, and burned it in the fireplace along with herbs and sage in an attempt at some form of ritual closure. This was not rational behavior. I was attempting to manage something psychologically that I couldn't manage rationally. That night, I listened more carefully to the sounds around the cabin. Around 1 a.m., there came a vocalization from the forest. It began as a low hum, barely audible, then shifted in frequency. The pitch rose and fell in patterns that almost suggested language, repetitive phonetic structures with variation. The sound continued for approximately 5 minutes, then stopped with sudden finality. I recorded it on my phone. Listening to the playback in the daylight hours, the sound was less dramatic. Still strange, but more easily attributed to wind moving through unusual rock formations or thermal vents creating acoustic effects. But in the dark, when the sound was live and present, it carried intention. It was communication, or at least an attempt at it. November arrived with a cold that felt terminal. Early season blizzards moved through the park, and the road to the nearest ranger station became increasingly difficult to travel. I made regular supply runs, maintaining contact with Rebecca through brief radio check-ins. These conversations were professional and minimal. She noted that my reports were standard, asked if I needed anything, and accepted my responses without pressing. She was respecting my space, unaware that the space had become occupied. I stopped trying to dismiss the prints. Instead, I began tracking them with methodical precision. I created a map on the cabin wall, marking locations and dates of sightings. The creature had a definable territory, approximately 30 square miles, with concentration around the thermal areas and the lake. It appeared to move in patterns, visiting certain locations on 3 to 4 day cycles. The patterns suggested intelligence and planning. The vocalizations became more frequent. Twice I heard them respond to natural sounds in the forest, as if in conversation with echo or wind. Once I heard what might have been 2 separate creatures producing these sounds simultaneously, though from different locations. The possibility that there was more than one forced me to reconsider everything. Were they territorial or social? Were they hunting together or defending against competition? On November 8th, I found the second gift. This time it was a complete carcass, a young elk, aged perhaps 2 years, placed in a clearing approximately 200 yards from the cabin. The animal had been killed recently, probably within the previous day. The kill pattern was violent but controlled. Trauma to the throat and upper chest, but no excessive damage to the carcass. The kill method suggested knowledge of anatomy, understanding of how to disable large prey efficiently. The meat was still fresh. Enough remained that another predator would have dismembered the carcass within hours, but it had been left, deliberately positioned in the clearing, waiting. Waiting for what? For me to find it? For me to understand? I did not touch the carcass. Instead, I photographed it, documented it, and left it to the natural decomposition process. Within days, ravens and eagles discovered it. Coyotes moved in. The clearing became a site of natural scavenging, but I checked it every few days, watching as the remains transformed from fresh kill to picked-over carcass to scattered bones. The message, if message it was, had been delivered. November brought unexpected storms, and I became essentially trapped at the cabin for periods of 5 and 6 days. The road remained impassable, and hiking was dangerous in whiteout conditions. I spent these periods reading, maintaining equipment, and listening to the sounds of the storm and whatever else moved in the darkness beyond the walls. There was an evening, perhaps 2 weeks into November, when I heard something that shifted everything. I was sitting near the cabin's east window, and I heard not a vocalization but knocking. 3 distinct impacts against the window frame, too deliberate to be wind-driven debris. I approached the window, and for a moment, in the dim light before dusk, I saw something move. Not clearly, not in a way I could definitively describe, but the impression was large, bipedal, and present. I did not look directly. I moved to the window's periphery and observed indirectly. In peripheral vision, there was shape. A figure standing perhaps 10 feet from the cabin, motionless. I could make out bulk and height and vague shoulder definition, but nothing more precise. When I turned to look directly, there was nothing. Only forest and snow and the empty world. But the knocking came again from a different window. I understand now what Marcus had experienced. The psychological toll of being observed, of being studied by something intelligent, of knowing that your understanding of the world was incomplete, that your category systems were insufficient. The mind attempts to compensate through pattern recognition and meaning-making. It wants to turn random events into narratives. It wants to understand. By early December, the lake had begun to freeze. I made fewer trips to Merlin Lake. The hike was increasingly dangerous in snowpack, and my psychological need for the ritual had diminished. There was less requirement for escape now. The cabin had become simultaneously less safe and more present in my awareness. I attempted one final excursion on December 2nd. I wanted to document the winter behavior of whatever was in the forest, to see if the patterns changed with weather and season. I hiked the 9 miles in early morning, while the snow was still packable and the light was clear. The forest was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. Snow-laden branches, ice crystals on remaining vegetation, the silence of a world at rest. At Merlin Lake, the ice had formed a partial layer, thick enough to walk on in some areas but dangerous in others. There were no prints today. The snow had fallen too recently to preserve the old marks. The shore was a blank surface, untouched by anything recognizable. I walked along the western edge of the lake, moving slowly, paying attention to the quality of silence. The forest was without sound. No birds, no wind, no distant animal calls, just the soft crunch of my footsteps on snow and the sound of my breathing. That's when I heard the breathing. It came from behind me, from somewhere in the forest that bordered the western shore. The breathing was heavy, exaggerated almost, certainly deliberate. I turned slowly. The forest was dense here, young trees close together, visibility limited to perhaps 30 feet. I could see no movement, no shape. But the breathing continued, matching my own rhythm closely enough that I could establish the creature's location approximately, perhaps 70 feet away, slightly elevated on the slope rising from the lake. I cannot explain why I didn't run. Fear is supposed to trigger movement, flight from threat, but I was held in a peculiar form of paralysis, a state between fight and flight that was neither. I was aware that I could die here. I was also aware that dying was not the intention. Something in the quality of the moment suggested observation rather than predation. The breathing stopped. In the absence of that sound, I became aware of another detail, a smell that had been present the entire time but which I'd suppressed. It was the same smell I'd encountered in the forest on October 17th, but here in the closed air near the lake, it was more intense. Something organic, yes, but with mineral notes and thermal chemical components. It was the smell of the forest and the hot springs combined, of something that existed in both environments simultaneously. I walked backward slowly, maintaining visual focus on the area where I'd heard the breathing. I walked backward for perhaps 50 feet, then turned and began hiking rapidly back toward the cabin. I didn't run. I chose not to trigger a chase response, but I moved with purpose and speed. Behind me, I heard movement. Something large moving through the forest, paralleling my path but maintaining distance. I forced myself not to accelerate beyond a fast walk. The creature moved with me for perhaps a mile, then the sound faded as the forest opened into the clearer areas nearer the cabin. I reached the cabin, locked the doors, a gesture I'd abandoned weeks earlier, and sat in the dark, trying to process what had occurred. The encounter had been unambiguously real. My heart rate, my adrenaline response, the texture of the memory, all confirmed that I had been in the presence of something large and potentially dangerous. Yet nothing had happened. There had been no attack, no aggressive behavior, not even a clear display of threat posturing. Just observation, just presence. What did it want? December deepened into a dark season. The park was quiet in that way that remote wilderness becomes quiet under heavy snow. Daylight hours contracted until the sun was barely above the horizon in the afternoon. I maintained my isolation, venturing out less frequently for supplies. I was in some sense beginning to mirror the creature, becoming nocturnal in habit, understanding the forest's patterns, adapting to an existence oriented around observation and territory. Rebecca called on December 11th. My monthly check-in had been missed. Her voice was professional and concerned. Everything fine? Did I need supplies brought out? I assured her I was well. My radio had been acting intermittently. I would maintain better contact. She accepted this, asked if I was sure, and when I confirmed, she said she'd check on me after the winter break if roads remained impassable. I did not tell her that I was no longer sure what I needed or what would constitute safety. The final entry in Marcus's journal had begun to make sense to me. He had written, "Leaving tomorrow, cannot stay longer," but he had stayed that final week. He documented his observations even while terrified, even while aware that something impossible was occurring. He'd stayed because the alternative, returning to the known world, filing reports, trying to explain, was in some ways more unbearable than the thing itself. I wondered sometimes what had happened to Marcus, whether he'd truly left, or whether the next researcher had found him missing, whether his journal was discovered as a document of mental illness or as evidence of something else. On December 18th, there was a knock at the cabin door. Clear, deliberate. 3 impacts with a rhythm that suggested humanoid pounding. I looked through the peephole and saw nothing. I opened the door carefully, hand on the frame, prepared to close it quickly. The porch was empty except for another gift, this time a human object, a bracelet, simple silver, with a distinctive pattern of stones. I knew that bracelet. It had belonged to Jennifer, the female hiker I'd helped on October 17th, the one from Ohio, separated from her husband, worried about him, relieved to be safe. I picked it up slowly, feeling its weight. The clasp was intact. It had been removed, not dropped. This is December 24th. I'm writing this by lantern light, and I've decided that tomorrow, when the weather permits, I will leave. I'm not reporting what's occurred. I'm not explaining the prints or the gifts or the encounters. I'll simply resign my position, citing personal reasons, and disappear into whatever comes next. I understand now what I think Marcus understood, what he tried and failed to articulate before abandoning this place. There are thresholds in the world, boundaries between what we believe is real and what lurks in the spaces we've neglected to investigate. These thresholds exist especially in places like this, vast, remote, beautiful wilderness where human authority is ultimately provisional. I don't believe in monsters. I believe in creatures that exist outside the categories we've constructed. I believe in intelligence that doesn't follow our patterns, that communicates in ways our language can't accommodate, that watches and waits with purpose we can only intuit. The creature, or creatures, have stopped leaving gifts. The prints around the cabin have become less frequent. The vocalizations have ceased. It's almost as if they're waiting for my decision, observing my deterioration or acceptance, curious about what I'll choose. Tomorrow, I'll leave. I'll drive out, submit my resignation, and I'll never speak of this again. The journal will stay. The cabin will return to its solitude. Perhaps Marcus's journal will be found again in another decade by another ranger curious enough to stay, or perhaps the creature will burn everything, erase the evidence, and will remain part of each other's mythology. Creatures that might have been real, documented in scattered notes, leaving questions rather than answers. I'm not afraid anymore. Fear requires the expectation of harm. What I am is aware. Aware that the world is larger than the categories we've built to contain it. Aware that sometimes intelligence speaks in languages we must learn rather than expect to be taught. Aware that some thresholds, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. The creature is close now, just beyond the window where I'm writing. I can feel its attention like presence. It's waiting. So am I. Some questions don't have answers. Some encounters exist only in the moment. And some of us are meant to be transformative witnesses, to see something impossible and then choose to live with that knowledge, carrying it forward into a world that won't believe us. The threshold has been crossed. There is no returning. I took the ranger position at Yellowstone because I needed to disappear. That's the truth nobody wants to hear when you fill out the federal employment forms. They want reasons like passion for conservation or love of nature. I gave them those answers too, but the real reason was simpler. I needed a place where nobody would think to look for me, where the nearest person lived 12 miles away, where my phone didn't work and my past couldn't follow. My name is Marcus Webb. I was 34 when I arrived at the station in the fall of 2019, carrying 2 duffel bags and a psychology degree I would never use again. The incident in Denver, the one that made my name toxic in every hospital and clinic across Colorado, seemed to matter less out here where the mountains swallowed everything, where the only eyes watching you belonged to elk and ravens. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Built in 1987 from lodgepole pine, weathered gray by decades of Montana winters. It sat on the eastern edge of the park, 3 miles from Hebron Lake, which I could reach by foot in about 40 minutes if the trail wasn't washed out. My primary responsibility was perimeter checks, trail maintenance, and rescue coordination. In reality, I was there to be alone. The superintendent, a woman named Julie Mercer, in her 50s with the permanent squint of someone who'd spent 30 years scanning horizons, gave me a tour that took 20 minutes. The radio, the emergency supplies, the rifle for euthanizing injured animals, the bear spray, the first aid kit that hadn't been updated since 2015. She explained the seasonal patterns. Most hikers clustered from June through September, the valley filled with people who treated the park like a theme park, wearing sneakers and carrying selfie sticks. By October, they thinned out. By November, I would be nearly alone. We get maybe 3 emergency calls all winter, Julie said, standing in the kitchen with its wood-burning stove that I would come to know as both comfort and torture. Last winter was calm. Winter before that, we had a hiker get turned around on the Mystic Falls Trail, confused about landmarks in the snow. He made it out okay. She didn't mention the ones who didn't make it out okay. I asked anyway. That was 2008, Julie said, and something shifted in her expression. She looked out the cabin's small window toward the tree line. Couple trying to hike to the falls after a snowstorm. We found them 2 weeks later, about a quarter mile off the trail. They'd gotten lost, built a small shelter using fallen branches. The woman was still alive when we found her, barely. She didn't make it to the hospital. The man, we never figured out what happened to him. He was just gone from their shelter. Walked away or something. In winter? In a snowstorm? People do strange things when they panic, Julie said. She didn't sound convinced when she said it. She left that afternoon and I watched her truck wind down the dirt road until the trees absorbed it. The silence that followed was profound. Not peaceful. I'd made a mistake thinking wilderness silence would be peaceful. It was the silence of a living thing that had learned to be very quiet. I unpacked my belongings in the cabin's single bedroom. I had books. Thoreau, Muir, Abbey, all the comfortable fiction of man against nature that ignores how nature isn't against you so much as indifferent to you. How it will kill you not out of malice but because you don't matter to it. I had a bottle of bourbon. I had no pictures of my family. I had a journal I promised myself I would fill with observations about wildlife and weather like a real ranger would. That night I sat in the rocking chair on the cabin's porch and listened to the darkness settle. Darkness at this elevation in this season is not merely the absence of light. It's a presence. It has weight. I could hear wind in the lodge poles, could hear something moving through the brush down by the tree line, could hear the particular silence that comes when all the small sounds stop at once because something larger has arrived. I was a psychologist who'd lost his license over an incident involving a patient's deterioration and my own documented failure to recognize what should have been obvious warning signs. I'd seen the human mind in crisis. I knew the shapes of breakdown, the geometry of delusion. Sitting in that darkness, I began to understand that wilderness had its own kind of madness. I made it through November without incident. I maintained the Northern Trail, rebuilt 3 sections of fence, documented elk migrations in my official log, and drank bourbon in measured amounts every evening. The weather held better than expected, only 2 significant snowfalls, nothing that trapped me or demanded rescue operations. In early December, around the 8th, I found the first sign. It was on the trail about 1.5 miles from the cabin, a section I hiked twice weekly out of habit. The track was deep in the snow, and at first I thought it was a bear despite the wrongness of the season. Bears shouldn't be awake, but the more I studied it, the more certain I became that it wasn't a bear. The footprint was roughly humanoid. That was my first thought. Roughly. The impression was deep, suggesting considerable weight, and the spacing between prints indicated a stride of nearly 5 feet. The depth was uneven, as if the weight wasn't distributed evenly, as if something was dragging one side. I've hiked these trails enough to know what human footprints look like, what animal tracks look like. This was neither. I took photographs with the digital camera the park provides for documentation. The images didn't capture what I saw in person. The prints looked smaller in the photos, less deliberate, less like something choosing to make a specific pattern. I reported it to Julie by radio that evening. Static swallowed my transmission twice before she responded. Could be a bear, she said. Big one, gait disturbed by arthritis or old injury. Bears are sleeping, I said. Not always. You get a warming trend, sometimes they're active. You get a scared animal, sometimes they don't sleep at all. That was reasonable. That was the kind of answer a rational person gives. I accepted it because I was trying very hard to be rational. I had spent the previous 5 years of my career attempting to convince other people that their perceptions were distorted by illness, by stress, by the particular way the human mind breaks under pressure. I didn't want my own mind to break, but something was wrong with the animals. The elk, which had been visible every morning from my cabin window, stopped appearing. The ravens that had called from the trees above my property each dawn went silent. I didn't hear coyotes anymore. The forest, which had been filled with the background noise of living things, became quieter than any forest should be. On December 15th, I found the remains of a deer about a quarter mile from the trail. I almost missed it. The snow was unbroken in that area, and it was only because I saw blood on the trees, arterial spray that had frozen dark red against the bark, that I looked down. The carcass was partially buried. That's what struck me hardest. It had been deliberately positioned under a fallen log, covered with branches and snow, as if something had been caching it. I'm not a hunter. The gut reaction was visceral anyway. The deer's spine had been crushed. Its legs were positioned at angles that didn't match its skeleton. The cavity where its organs should have been was empty, cleaned out with precision. Small teeth marks, numerous, suggested that something had sat here a long time feeding, or something large had sat here and been very gentle about what it was doing. I pulled out my radio, then I stopped. What was I going to report? That I found a dead deer in the woods where nothing eats deer? That an animal had made a cache? That was normal predator behavior. I was a ranger. I was supposed to document deaths, yes, but not create panic from normal ecology. I photographed the deer and took exact GPS coordinates. I hiked back to the cabin. That night I realized my hands were shaking as I made dinner. Not from cold, from something underneath the cold, something primal that had nothing to do with rational thought. The part of my brain that was still descended from ancestors who understood that you don't leave the fire after dark wasn't listening to the part that had psychology credentials. I sat in front of the wood stove and read Thoreau's Walden-like scripture. December 22nd, the winter solstice. The day I went to Hebron Lake because I was going insane from staying in the cabin, and I thought perhaps fresh air and a change of scenery might help. The trail was worse than I'd anticipated. The creek I normally crossed had iced over, but thinly enough that I had to move carefully, probing with a branch for solid ground. The forest closed in more densely here, the lodge poles so thick that even at noon the light had a submarine quality. I could see my breath. I could see my footprints behind me, each one precise and recorded in snow. The lake, when I reached it, was a flat plain of white under a pewter sky. I sat on the rocks at the shore that I'd sat on probably 100 times before, just staring out at nothing. The silence here was even more profound than at the cabin. I could hear blood in my ears. I could hear my own breathing like something mechanical, like my body was a machine I was watching from outside. It was there that I heard the sound. Not a sound, exactly. A modulation in the silence. That's the best way I can describe it. Like the air between me and the far shore of the lake had shifted its frequency. Like something had displaced it. I stood up without meaning to. The figure was at the far end of the lake, at the tree line where the pines came down nearly to the water's edge. At first I thought it was a person. It had that basic shape, 2 legs, a torso, arms, but it was moving wrong, that dragging quality I remembered from the footprints, one side pulling heavy while the other reached forward and then had to be dragged again. It stopped when it saw me. Or I assumed it saw me, based on how its head tilted. Even from a quarter mile away I could tell something was wrong with its head. The proportions weren't right. Too long, too narrow at the jaw. Like something was stretching the human shape from the inside out. I don't remember deciding to leave. I remember running. I remember the snow becoming deeper as I moved toward the tree line, pulling at my legs. I remember the sound coming after me. Not running sounds, just that same dragging step, but moving faster than anything should have been able to move while dragging itself. I don't remember the knife in my hand until I was back at the cabin and I realized I'd torn open the seam of my jacket. For 4 days, I didn't leave the cabin. I told myself I was sick. I had a fever. I had influenza. I had a legitimate reason to stay inside. But when I took my temperature, it was normal. My hands just wouldn't stop moving. I kept them busy, chopping wood, cleaning the kitchen, reordering supplies that were already ordered. Anything to prevent them from being still, because when my hands were still, my mind had too much space to work. I documented what I could remember in my journal. The figure, the proportions, the way it had looked at me. My rational mind had 100 explanations. Bear walking upright, common when they're curious. Bigfoot, reported in the park since the 1980s, likely just a misidentified bear or large elk. Hallucination brought on by isolation and stress. A psychotic break, the culmination of the one I'd been circling since Denver. Pick any explanation. They all led to the same conclusion. I was not trustworthy regarding my own perceptions anymore. On December 26th, I made contact with Julie by radio. "I'd like to request some time in the valley," I said. "I need to pick up supplies and file reports that require internet access." "You can file reports from there," she said. "That's what the laptop's for. It's not working properly. Internet connection is failing. Static. Then, you sound weird. You sick? Just tired. The isolation." I made myself laugh. It came out hollow. "It's getting to me." Another pause. I knew what she was thinking, that I was another person who'd arrived at a ranger station to escape something, and now I was showing signs of breaking. She'd seen it before, probably. The kind of person who sought wildness to cure a disease that only got worse in silence. "Come in for a few days," she said. "We can have the IT guy look at the laptop. You can spend some time around people, then you can go back out refreshed." But I couldn't leave. That was the thing I couldn't explain to her. If I left the cabin, if I wasn't here to watch the perimeter, then it would come when I wasn't watching. It would come to the cabin and find my home empty, and then it would wait. That was what things like that did. They learned your patterns, and they waited for the moment when your attention broke. "I'll be fine," I told her. "Just a passing thing." I could feel her skepticism across the radio waves. I found the second deer on December 28th, 200 yards from the cabin's back door. This one was fresh. The body was still warm, cooling into the snow. Like the first, it had been cached and partially opened, as if something had been feeding on it slowly, as if something knew how to preserve meat for later consumption. What struck me most was the pattern. The deer had been arranged, laid out specifically. One front leg extended northward, the other folded against its chest. The hind legs positioned at an angle that served no predatory purpose. It was an arrangement, a statement, a message. I brought the carcass inside. I don't know why. Part of me needed to examine it properly, without the lens of my own panic. Part of me needed to confirm that what I was seeing was real and external and not just the architecture of my own failing mind. In the harsh light of the cabin's kitchen, with the carcass on the counter and my hands shaking so badly I could barely write, I documented exactly what I was seeing. The marks on the ribs where something had opened the animal, the precise way that connective tissue had been separated from bone, the intelligence of it. That was what I couldn't stop circling back to. The intelligence. Something intelligent was communicating with me. That night, I sat in the rocking chair on the porch without the lamp on, just darkness, and the cold wind from the north. I could hear something moving out there in the trees, not far, close enough that I could track its position by sound. It was circling the cabin. Slowly, methodically, like a hand examining an object. I had the rifle inside, loaded. I'd checked 3 times. "What do you want?" I called out into the darkness. The movement stopped. In that stopped moment, I understood something about silence. There's a kind of silence that's the absence of sound, and then there's the kind where something is listening so intently that the listening itself becomes a noise, fills the space until there's no room for anything else. "I'm not what you're looking for," I said. It was a stupid thing to say. I don't know what made me say it. The dragging sound started again, but different now, circling wider, moving away from the cabin toward the tree line. I sat there until dawn, watching the darkness, waiting for understanding that never came. By December 31st, the entire northern section of my patrol territory had changed. The animals were gone, not just avoiding the area, gone. I found no tracks, no signs of passage. The forest had become a void. The weather broke on New Year's Eve. A warm wind came down from the north, unusual for this time of year. The kind of weather that Julie would later tell me happened once every 10 to 15 years, a thermal anomaly that melted the snow and exposed the ground underneath. That's when I saw them, footprints. Dozens. Covering the trail from the cabin to the lake, from the lake back toward the forest, an entire architecture of movement recorded in the now visible earth. They were all the same basic pattern, dragging on one side, purposeful on the other. They crossed each other, layered on top of each other, as if multiple instances of the same thing had been walking this ground. I photographed them all. I documented GPS coordinates. I told myself this was evidence. This was real. This was something that existed outside my own mind and therefore could be shared, verified, understood by other people who didn't have the particular vulnerabilities of my damaged psychology. But I knew, even as I documented, that no one would understand. They would see bear prints, deer trails, the ordinary disturbance of animals. They would not see the geometry I saw. The geometry of intention. That evening, I listened to the news on the small battery-powered radio I kept in the kitchen. A missing person report from Mammoth Hot Springs. A hiker who'd gone out on December 29th and hadn't returned to his lodge. The search was being organized. Dogs had been brought in. The park rangers in that sector were coordinating with the National Guard. I didn't tell them about the prints near my cabin. Instead, I packed a bag. Not to flee. I wasn't fleeing anymore. I was done with that. But to go to the lake one more time, to the place where I'd seen the thing clearly, where the communication had been most direct, to understand, if I could, what it wanted. The hike took me 3 hours in the darkness. I moved slowly, carefully, with the rifle slung across my back and a flashlight in one hand. The trail was mud from the melt, and my boots made sounds that echoed off the canyon walls as I descended. Everything was listening. I could feel the listening like weight. The lake was partially thawed, the ice rotten and gray, moving slightly with currents I couldn't see. The figure was already there, standing on the opposite shore, visible in the beam of my flashlight, up close as I dared to get, which was still a quarter-mile across the water and unstable ice. I could see more details. The skin was grayish-white, the texture like something exposed too long to cold and sun. The head was elongated, the jaw extended into a kind of muzzle, but not an animal's muzzle, something between an animal and a human, as if something had taken human DNA and stretched it like pulled taffy into a shape that shouldn't exist. When it moved, it was with that dragging quality, but I understood now that it wasn't disability. It was something about how its body was constructed, as if joints bent in more directions than a normal creature's joints could bend. It didn't approach. It just stood there, watching me. "Are you looking for something?" I called across the water. It tilted its head. The motion was too slow, took too long, as if the muscles that controlled the neck had to work against something. "Are you hungry?" The dragging step came toward the water. Not fast, not threatening, just purposeful. It reached the edge of the lake and stopped. The face, and I was certain now it was a face, was looking back at me with something that wasn't quite intelligence but something worse, something that was the echo of intelligence, turned toward where I stood. Then it knelt. Actually knelt, bent down on its legs like something preparing to drink, or like something preparing to wait. I understood in that moment that I had asked the wrong question. It wasn't hungry. Or rather, hunger wasn't the right word. Hunger implied need, deficit, something that could be sated. What I was looking at was something that consumed differently, something that didn't eat to fill a void but ate to maintain itself. Something that had been here a long time. Something that would be here a long time after I was gone. I walked back to the cabin in the gray pre-dawn light. By the time I reached it, my decision was made. I wrote the letter to Julie on the laptop, printed it, left it on the kitchen table. I described the footprints, the dead animals, the figure at the lake, everything. I detailed my psychological history and my specific vulnerabilities to perceptual distortion. I explained carefully and methodically why the reports I was making could not be trusted and should be verified by another ranger before any action was taken. I packed the rifle, my jacket, and a headlamp. The trail to the north took me away from the inhabited sections of the park, toward the territory where the backcountry becomes too remote for casual hiking. It was where the missing hiker from Mammoth hadn't returned from. It was where probably there were others like me, people who'd seen something at the edge of the park, at the edge of the world that maps could show, and had gone to find it because the not knowing was worse than whatever the knowing might bring. As I walked, I became aware that I was being followed. Not threatened, followed. The dragging sounds kept pace with me, sometimes closer, sometimes far back. It wasn't hunting me, it was showing me something, taking me somewhere. In the distance, I could hear voices. Calling, search and rescue, looking for the missing hiker. Looking probably for me now too, since the letter would have brought attention. But the voices were going the wrong direction, toward the roads and the accessible areas where they expected to find people who got lost. They wouldn't find anything if I didn't want them to find it. The sound of dragging footsteps grew closer. But I wasn't afraid anymore. I understood finally what this was about. Not hunger, not malice, not the simple predatory calculation of an animal. This was about knowing. About being known. I walked deeper into the forest. following the thing that followed me, going toward whatever was waiting in the places that didn't appear on any map I'd ever seen. The part of me that was still Marcus Webb, still the psychologist who'd run from Denver looking for solitude, knew this was a break, the final one, the one that wouldn't be coming back from. But the part of me that had become something else in these weeks in the wilderness, that had learned to understand the language of dragging footsteps and arranged carcasses, knew it was the only true thing I'd felt since I arrived. As I walked, the sun rose behind me over Hebron Lake, and the forest swallowed the sound of rescue workers calling from far away. And I became one of the stories the rangers would tell each other during the long winters, a man who came into the wilderness looking for safety and found something else instead. The official report filed by the search and rescue team noted that no trace of Marcus Webb was ever found. The letter he left behind was documented and filed, his psychological history reviewed and filed, the dead animals explained as the work of scavengers and natural predation. The footprints in the mud around the cabin were photographed but ultimately identified as bear prints, large ones, made by an animal disturbed by the warm snap in temperatures. Some rangers, in the years that followed, reported unusual tracks in that area. Some heard dragging sounds during winter patrols. All of them noted carefully in their reports that the sounds could be wind, that the tracks could be natural, that there was nothing dangerous, nothing that couldn't be explained. That's how you survive in wilderness. Not by seeing what's there, but by learning not to see, by making your reports in the right way, using the right words, by understanding that some things that live in the forest are better left alone, better left unseen, better left not confirmed as real. But on December 28th of each year, rangers who patrol that northern sector report finding a dead deer carefully arranged, partially consumed, and none of them have ever reported it officially. I accepted the position at Yellowstone because I needed to disappear, not in the sense of running from the law or anything dramatic like that. I was running from the ordinary collapse of a life that had become too small. 15 years managing park maintenance in Colorado had dulled something essential in me, something I couldn't name but could feel dying in my chest each morning. The job posting came across my screen on a Tuesday in February, a ranger position at a remote station near Moloch Lake, one of the lesser-known lakes in the Northern Territory of Yellowstone. They needed someone willing to work alone, willing to embrace the isolation, willing to understand that help would not arrive quickly if something went wrong. The pay was modest. The housing was a small cabin built in 1987, maintained but not upgraded. The radio equipment was functional but temperamental, no cellular service. The nearest ranger station was 43 miles away by unpaved mountain road. It was in every measurable way the last place anyone ambitious would want to be. I wanted to be there more than I had wanted anything in years. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 42 years old. I have dark hair going gray at the temples, and I carry my weight unevenly from an old hiking injury that never quite healed properly. I don't drink much anymore, and I don't speak about my personal life because there isn't much left to speak of. The divorce was finalized 2 years before I took this job, and the custody arrangement meant my daughter visited twice a year. By the time I arrived at Moloch Lake in late August, I had convinced myself that solitude was a form of healing. The cabin sat on a rise about a quarter-mile from the water. To reach it, you drove past the ranger station, a smaller structure that housed equipment and records, and followed a switchback trail that climbed through lodgepole pine and Douglas fir. The lake itself was stunning in a way that photographs could never capture. The water was so clear that you could see 30 feet down to the rocky bottom. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still holding traces of old snow despite the season. The air was thin and sharp, and on calm mornings the reflection was so perfect that the sky seemed to continue uninterrupted from the heavens into the earth. I told myself I was at peace there. The first week was administrative. I met with the supervisor who drove out to brief me on protocols. His name was Robert, a competent man in his 50s who seemed relieved that I had actually shown up and appeared sane. He explained the radio schedule. I was to check in at 7 in the morning and 6 in the evening. He detailed the seasonal concerns, the increasing popularity of backcountry hiking, the need to monitor for illegal camping, the mandatory wildlife protocols if I encountered bears. Everything he said was practical and reassuring. Everything he said made the isolation seem manageable. What he didn't mention was what the locals in Gardiner had whispered about when I'd stopped for supplies. I'd heard it from Diane, who ran the grocery store. She mentioned it casually, as though it were ordinary gossip, while she was ringing up my purchases of freeze-dried meals and coffee. She said that Moloch Lake had a reputation, Nothing specific, nothing she could really articulate beyond a general sense that people didn't stay long at that station. The previous ranger had lasted 3 months, the one before him 6 weeks. When I asked what the problem was, Diane's expression became carefully neutral, and she told me that some places just had difficulty keeping staff. People got lonely, people got spooked. I assumed she meant they found the isolation psychologically difficult. I told her I would be fine. By the second week, I had established a rhythm. I woke at 5:30, made coffee on the propane stove, and watched the light return to the forest. I patrolled the perimeter on foot, checking for signs of illegal activity or environmental damage. I maintained equipment and records. I read in the afternoons. I cooked simple meals. I was, by almost any measure, content. It was during the third week that I first heard the sound. I was walking along the lake's eastern shore in the early evening, about 7 o'clock. The sun was still visible above the western mountains, casting everything in shades of amber and rust. The water was moving gently, rippling in patterns that suggested a breeze higher up that hadn't yet reached ground level. I was moving without particular purpose, simply walking, when I heard something that stopped me in place. It was a sound like a voice, or like something that wanted to be a voice. It came from somewhere across the water, from the dark slope of the mountain beyond the far shore. It wasn't loud, but it carried across the lake with an almost mechanical clarity. It sounded like someone calling out, like a single word or name. But the sound was wrong in ways I couldn't immediately identify. The pitch was uneven. The timbre seemed to shift in the middle of the sound itself. It lasted for perhaps 2 seconds. I waited for it to come again, but there was only wind in the pines and the gentle movement of water. I told myself it was an elk call. I knew it wasn't. Elk calls are distinctive and natural. What I had heard was neither. But I was not afraid yet, only puzzled. I continued my walk, though I stayed aware of the silence in a way I hadn't been before. That night, I sat in the cabin reading a paperback mystery I'd picked up in town. The oil lamps cast steady light, and the cabin was warm and secure. Outside, the temperature had dropped, and the forest had settled into the particular quiet of a late summer night in the mountains. I was aware of nothing amiss until I heard it again. This time, the sound came from very close, perhaps from somewhere near the cabin's northern wall. It was the same not-quite voice, and it carried the same unsettling quality of something trying to approximate human speech but failing in subtle ways. It came 3 times, each instance separated by perhaps 10 seconds of silence. Then nothing. I got up and went to the window. My reflection stared back at me, and beyond it, darkness. The forest beyond the glass was black and featureless. I could see perhaps 5 yards into it before the trees became indistinguishable from the night itself. I waited at the window for almost an hour, but nothing else emerged from the darkness. By the next morning, I had rationalized it completely. Sound carried strangely in mountains. There were animals I might not have heard before. The isolation was perhaps working on my mind more than I'd anticipated. These were reasonable explanations, and I held on to them. But the sounds continued. They never came during the day, only in the evening hours or at night. They came from different locations, sometimes from the direction of the lake, sometimes from deeper in the forest, once from what seemed to be directly beneath the cabin's floor. They were always similar in quality, that half-formed attempt at speech, that wrongness of pitch and tone that made my brain hurt when I tried to focus on it. By the end of the 4th week, I had started keeping a log, not because I believed anything was genuinely wrong, but because documenting the phenomenon seemed like the action of a rational person. I would record the time, the direction, a description of the sound. This catalog of normalcy reassured me. As long as I was observing and recording, I was in control. The first lost hiker came to my station on a Friday afternoon in early September. Her name was Monica, and she was in her early 60s, wearing outdoor gear that was appropriate but expensive looking. She had become separated from her hiking group somewhere around Ridge Pass, about 8 miles west of my station. She had been walking alone for 4 hours before stumbling onto the ranger trail that led to my cabin. When she arrived at the station, she was exhausted and dehydrated but not injured. I gave her water and a place to rest. I radioed the main station and coordinated the response. I answered her questions about what had happened and assured her that being lost was not uncommon and that she had done the right things by staying on established trails and remaining calm. She told me that she had heard something strange while walking, some kind of sound that had made her nervous. When I asked her to describe it, she became vague, saying only that it sounded wrong and that she had felt afraid without understanding why. I did not tell her about the sounds I had been hearing. By the time the search and rescue team arrived by vehicle, Monica was stable and coherent. She thanked me genuinely, and as they drove her away, I felt something strange in my chest. It was not quite satisfaction, but something close to it. I had been useful. I had performed the function I was employed to perform. For a few hours, someone had depended on me for safety, and I had provided that safety without hesitation. The second lost hiker was a man named Derek, who came to the station 3 days later. He was younger, perhaps in his mid-30s, and he had a deep scratch on his arm that he claimed came from rushing through brush while trying to find his way back to the trail. He told a similar story to Monica's, separated from his group, walked for hours, heard strange sounds that frightened him. When I asked what the sounds were, he described them with a frustration that suggested he couldn't articulate what he'd heard any better than he could forget it. Like someone trying to talk, he said. Like a voice that wasn't quite right. Like something human trying to sound human and not quite managing it. I felt something shift in my understanding. The sounds were not unique to my experience at the cabin. Others were hearing them. Others were being frightened by them. How many times did you hear it? I asked. 3 times, Derek said. Maybe 4. I lost count. I just kept moving faster, trying to get back to where I could see other people. He looked at me carefully. You asking because you've heard it too? I chose my words with precision. I've heard sounds that I couldn't immediately identify. It's not unusual in a wilderness setting. Derek nodded slowly, not believing me but not wanting to pursue it further. As September progressed, I documented 4 more incidents of lost or spooked hikers. Each had heard the sounds. Each had experienced an overwhelming sense of wrongness without being able to explain what had triggered that sense. None of them had encountered anything concrete. None of them had seen anything, but all of them carried the weight of having been in proximity to something that their nervous systems recognized as dangerous, even as their conscious minds had no framework for understanding what they had encountered. I began to research during the evenings. The cabin had a small library of previous rangers' notes and park records. I read through them carefully, paying attention to incident reports and notations. There were references to unusual animal behavior stretching back decades. There were a handful of mentions of hikers who had heard strange sounds near Moloch Lake specifically. One report from 1994 described a ranger who had abandoned his post due to environmental and psychological stress. Another from 2001 simply noted that the station had been left empty for 6 months because staffing challenges had made it untenable. I found older materials in a box in the storage shed, records and papers that predated the park's modern database. These were harder to interpret, handwritten notes from rangers whose names I would never know, entries that were often cryptic or incomplete. But there were patterns. Reports of sounds, references to local Native American legends, notes about animals behaving strangely, and underneath it all, a thread of anxiety that seemed to run through decades of record-keeping. One entry from 1987, written by a ranger named Michael Kessler, was more detailed than the others. He had written, "The sounds come every evening if the temperature drops enough. They originate from various points around the lake and in the forest. I have attempted to locate their source on several occasions, but they cease before I can pinpoint a direction. Other rangers have heard them too, though it seems to take weeks or months for the experience to accumulate enough weight that someone will mention it. My theory is that the sounds are produced by the local elk or deer population in response to some environmental stimulus I haven't yet identified. However, I will note that the sounds cause an involuntary fear response that seems disproportionate to the stimulus itself. Some part of the human brain appears to find these vocalizations genuinely threatening. After 3 months at this station, I have begun to experience insomnia and a persistent anxiety that I recognize as unhealthy. I am requesting transfer to a lower elevation station. The entry was dated October 12, 1987. The ranger's next entry was his final one. A brief note stating he was being transferred and wishing his successor well. I read this entry multiple times. The acknowledgement that the sounds triggered fear responses that seemed disproportionate to the stimuli resonated with something I had been experiencing but hadn't articulated. The fear I felt when hearing the sounds wasn't based on any objective danger I could identify. It came from somewhere older and less rational, from the parts of the brain that processed threat and survival without consulting conscious reasoning. By mid-September, the autumn weather had arrived in earnest. The nights were cold, dropping below freezing, and the first snow had appeared on the highest peaks. I had settled into a routine of paranoia and rationalization, a strange equilibrium where I documented everything while trying to convince myself that nothing extraordinary was occurring. Then the hiker named Samantha came to the station, and everything shifted. She was young, perhaps 25, a serious backpacker who had been walking the park's remote trails for weeks. She arrived at the station in the early evening, and I immediately recognized that something about her mental state was different from the previous lost hikers. They had been frightened and disoriented. She was beyond frightened. She was operating on adrenaline and the absolute limit of her nervous system's capacity to function. She was also injured. The wound was on her leg, above the knee, and it was not an ordinary injury. The skin was torn in a way that suggested something with claws or sharp edges had been dragged across her flesh. It was not terribly deep, but it was wide, and it was absolutely not consistent with any standard hiking accident. I cleaned the wound and bandaged it while she sat in my kitchen, unable to stop shaking. She drank water in small sips and refused food. When I asked her what had happened, she couldn't answer at first. She just sat there, staring at nothing, her body moving in small tremors that seemed involuntary. Finally, she began to speak. "It was following me," she said, "for hours. First I heard it, then I knew it was close. I could feel it behind me. I kept walking faster, and it kept coming, and the sounds it was making." She trailed off, her hands gripping the table so hard that her knuckles whitened. "The sounds like something trying to talk. Like something that had learned how voices worked but not why." "Did you see it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. "No," she said. "No, I never saw it. I was too afraid to turn around. But I could hear it. It was so close. I could hear it breathing, and the breathing didn't sound right either. It sounded too big, too deep, too—" She couldn't find the word. She just shook her head. "When did it attack?" I asked. "When I tried to run," she said. "I decided to make a break for it, to find the main trail, to find people. I ran and it was faster. It came right up behind me, and I felt something on my leg, hot, sharp. It was just a swipe, like it was testing what I was, and then it backed off. I kept running and it didn't follow me. I don't know why it didn't follow me." I treated the wound with antibiotics and called for emergency evacuation. While we waited for the helicopter, Samantha sat in the cabin and gradually became more coherent, though no less traumatized. I asked her to describe the sounds in detail, trying to get beyond the general impression of wrongness that all the previous hikers had reported. "Like a word," she said, "or like half a word. Like someone trying to say something, but the sound was coming from somewhere it shouldn't come from. Like it was coming from inside the throat, but not from a human throat. Something wider, something deeper. It would come 3 or 4 times and then stop, and I would think it was over, and then it would start again." "Could it have been an animal?" I asked. "A strange elk call? Some kind of bird?" She looked at me with something like pity. "No," she said. "It wasn't an animal. Animals have patterns. This didn't have a pattern. It was intelligent, but not in a way that made sense. Like something that understood language, but not the way humans understand it." The helicopter arrived as darkness fell. I watched them load Samantha into it, watched the lights rise and disappear into the night sky. After the sound of the rotors faded, the forest seemed impossibly quiet. I stood outside the cabin for a long time, looking at the dark shapes of the trees against the dark sky, listening to the small sounds of the forest at night. Somewhere out there, something that could move silently enough that a careful hiker might not see it had come close enough to wound her. Something that could produce sounds that bypassed human rational thinking and triggered primal fear. Something that was in some sense I didn't want to fully articulate. Intelligent. I went inside and locked the doors, both of them, a gesture that felt entirely inadequate. The sounds became more frequent after Samantha's departure. I documented them with obsessive precision, but I had stopped trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation. Some part of me had accepted a threshold beyond which denial becomes impossible. The documentation continued because recording facts felt like maintaining a connection to objective reality, like bearing witness to something that should be witnessed rather than forgotten or minimized. The sounds came most frequently in the hours between sunset and midnight. They originated from different locations, sometimes from the forest immediately around the cabin, sometimes from across the lake, sometimes from deep in the backcountry. They followed no predictable pattern in terms of timing or location, but they were always the same in quality, that half-formed attempt at human vocalization, that wrongness that made my teeth ache and my chest tight. I had stopped going outside after dark. I had begun making sure the cabin doors were locked. I had started keeping a flashlight by the bed and a knife within easy reach. These precautions were not based on any rational assessment of threat. They were based on something more fundamental, an animal understanding that something predatory moved through the forest, and that I should make myself less vulnerable to it. September turned into October, and the weather became increasingly unstable. There were days of clear autumn cold, followed by days of sleet and wind that seemed to come from nowhere and leave just as suddenly. The trees began to lose their needles and leaves, and the forest opened up in ways that made it feel simultaneously more visible and more threatening. Visibility improved, but so did the feeling of exposure. Robert came by for a check-in on October 7th, 3 months into my tenure. He arrived in the late afternoon in a Park Service vehicle, and his first comment was that I looked like I'd lost weight. I told him it was the altitude and the work, both of which were true, though they were not the complete truth. He asked how things were going with the station. I told him everything was fine, all systems operational, no incidents of concern. He seemed to accept this, though he studied me carefully during our conversation. Before he left, he asked a question that suggested he had not completely bought my assurances. "You hearing anything strange out here?" he asked. "Sounds in the forest at night, anything like that?" "Nothing unusual for a wilderness area," I said, which was technically true, though perhaps not in the way he meant the question. "Good," he said. "Moloch Lake Station has had some trouble keeping people. The previous ranger had some psychological issues. Before him, there was one who just didn't adapt to the isolation. I want to make sure you're doing okay with the solitude." "I'm doing fine," I said. "I prefer it to the chaos of regular society." He nodded, but there was something in his expression that suggested he had received similar reassurances from previous rangers. He left before dark, and I watched his vehicle disappear down the switchback road with relief that was probably more intense than the occasion warranted. That night the sounds were louder and closer than they had been before. One came from somewhere on the cabin's eastern side, near the bedroom window. It came 3 times in succession, each instance louder and more insistent than the last. I lay in bed listening to my own heart rate accelerating, my rational mind noting that fear was counterproductive, while my animal brain screamed that I should be afraid. The window was closed and the cabin was secure, and none of that mattered because something outside knew I was here, and it was trying to communicate with me in the only way it knew how. The next morning, I went to examine the area around the cabin. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I was able to see clear impressions where something had been moving near the eastern wall. The footprints, if they could be called that, were wrong in a way that I struggled to articulate even as I looked directly at them. They were too large to be human. They appeared to be bipedal, but the weight distribution was wrong, the stride length inconsistent, the depth of the impressions suggesting something very heavy, but they were also not consistent with any bears I had ever encountered. The shape was not right, the spacing was not right. I photographed them with the cabin's small digital camera, taking multiple shots from different angles. Then I erased the images. There was no use in having them, no one would believe them, and more importantly, I realized with a strange clarity, I did not want there to be physical evidence. As long as the sounds remained subjective experiences that I had only heard but not seen, I could maintain the framework of ambiguity. As long as there was a possibility, however faint, that I was misinterpreting things, I could continue functioning. Physical evidence would require a confrontation with what was actually happening, and I was not sure I was ready for that. But the understanding was there now, underneath all my rationalizations and precautions. Something was living in the forest around Moloch Lake. It was intelligent in a way that animals typically were not. It produced sounds that seemed designed to trigger fear. It had wounded a hiker, and it was aware of me in my cabin. It came close repeatedly, testing the boundaries of my shelter, attempting communication that its vocal cords were not quite designed for. I began to understand the pattern of why previous rangers had left. The isolation itself was not unbearable. The weather was manageable. The work was straightforward. What was unbearable was the low-level constant awareness that something intelligent and other was aware of you, that it was watching, that it was learning, that one day, for reasons you could not predict or influence, it might decide to stop limiting itself to proximity and sounds. By October 15th, I had stopped maintaining the pretense of normalcy in my logs. My evening check-ins with the main station remained professional and sparse, but my personal journal had become increasingly detailed in its documentation of fear. I wrote, "It understands fear. That's the only explanation. The sounds it makes are not random. They are designed to trigger a specific response. They violate some deep expectation about how the human voice should sound, and this violation is registered as dangerous at a level deeper than conscious processing. Every creature it speaks to feels the wrongness of the sound and fears it accordingly. This is not an accident. This is a strategy." I wrote, "I am running low on supplies for the winter. Robert will return in November for a supply delivery. I am considering asking to be transferred, but part of me wants to stay. Part of me wants to understand what is happening. This impulse frightens me more than the creature itself. I wrote the footprints have become more frequent. I found more of them today near the lake shore. Whatever it is spending more time around my cabin and the station. It is becoming bolder, or I am becoming more aware. I am not sure which is worse. By the third week of October, I had made a decision that I recognized was probably insane. I decided to try to locate the creature, not to confront it, but to observe it, to gather data, to answer the question that had been growing in my mind: what exactly was I sharing this forest with? The weather had cleared, and the early morning was bright and cold. I prepared carefully, taking a rifle from the station's equipment locker, even though I was not sure what good a rifle would do against something that moved that quickly and seemed to understand tactics. I took binoculars. I took a camera with a telephoto lens. I took water and snack food. I took my radio, though I was not confident that anyone would hear me if something went wrong. I started my search in the area where the footprints had been most concentrated, about a mile northeast of the cabin. I moved slowly and carefully, trying to track the pattern of movement, trying to understand where the creature was spending its time. The forest around Moloch Lake was dense with lodgepole pines and scattered clearings where smaller trees and shrubs had a chance to grow. The undergrowth was thick enough to impede movement, but not impeded enough to leave clear tracks. I found evidence of the creature's passage: broken branches, places where the vegetation had been trampled, marks on tree bark that seemed to have been made deliberately rather than accidentally. I spent hours moving through the forest, my mind focused on the physical work of tracking while remaining intensely aware of everything around me. The wind was minimal, coming from the northeast, which meant my scent was being carried away from where I was searching. That was good. That meant the creature would not know I was coming, not until I was close enough to see it. The sun was beginning to descend toward the western mountains when I found the den. It was not what I had been expecting. The creature had moved into what appeared to be an old mine shaft or cave system set into a hillside about 2 miles from the cabin. The entrance was partially obscured by overgrown vegetation, and it would have been invisible to anyone not looking specifically for it. I approached cautiously, moving downwind, keeping low. There was a smell emanating from the cave, not the smell of an animal den, but something else. Something organic but deeply wrong. It was the smell of something that had been dead for a long time, decomposing in ways that nature had not quite evolved to handle. It was the smell of a refrigerator in a house that had stood empty for months after the power was cut. I stood at the cave entrance and forced myself to look inside. The interior was dark, but my eyes adjusted gradually. What I saw in those first few seconds of sight was something that would occupy my thoughts for the rest of my life. Something that my conscious mind would attempt to reframe and rationalize, but something that my animal brain had understood with absolute clarity. I was not looking at anything that existed naturally in the world. The creature that occupied the cave was large, perhaps 8 feet tall when it stood fully upright, which was rare. Most of the time, it seemed to move with its weight forward, less like a walking posture and more like a stalking gait. Its frame was vaguely humanoid in the arrangement of limbs, but all the proportions were wrong. The shoulders were too broad, the arms were too long and too thin. The head was elongated in a way that suggested the brain case had been stretched and flattened. Its skin was dark, almost black, but there was something about the texture that seemed wrong, as though the skin itself was not quite what skin should be. It might have been hair, or it might have been something else entirely. But it was the face that held my attention. The face was the closest thing about the creature to being identifiably mammalian. It had eyes set forward, predatory, intelligent. It had a nose of sorts, though it seemed too small for the head, and it had a mouth that could open far wider than any human mouth. A mouth with teeth that were too numerous and too regular, arranged in ways that suggested the creature understood what teeth were meant to do and had optimized itself accordingly. And it was looking at me. The moment I made eye contact with the creature, it moved with speed that seemed to erase the distance between us. One moment it was across the cave, and the next moment it was in the entrance, blocking the light, coming at me with a speed that my conscious mind could not adequately process. I did what I could. I raised the rifle and fired. The sound of the shot was enormous in the mountain air, and the recoil was harder than I expected. I staggered backward, and my finger was already moving to fire again, but the creature had already moved to the side. The second shot hit nothing but rock and dust. I fired a third time, and this time the creature actually cried out. That sound again, the half-formed vocalization that was not speech, that was something trying to be speech and failing, but now it carried a note of pain and rage and frustration. The creature fell back into the cave, and I did not stay to see what it would do next. I ran. I ran through the forest, through the undergrowth that grabbed at my clothes and scratched my face, down the hillside, and back toward the direction of the cabin. I could hear the creature behind me, crashing through the forest, making that sound, that impossible sound. I did not look back. I did not slow down. I ran until my legs felt like they were on fire and my lungs felt like they were tearing open. And even then I ran. I made it back to the cabin just as darkness fell. I locked all the doors and windows and sat in the middle of the main room with every light in the place burning and my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the rifle. The creature did not approach the cabin that night, but I could hear it moving in the forest, and I could hear it making that sound, repeating it over and over, as though it were trying to call me back out, as though it had something to say to me and could not quite manage to say it with the equipment it had available. By the time the sun rose, I had made a decision. I was going to document everything, and then I was going to contact Robert and request immediate transfer. I could no longer pretend this was anything manageable or survivable in the long term. I had seen the creature. I had engaged with it. I had wounded it, which meant it would not be inclined to tolerate my presence much longer. The decision gave me a strange sense of peace. I had done what I could. I had borne witness. Now I would remove myself from the situation. The next morning I wrote a detailed account of everything I had observed, seen, and experienced at Moloch Lake Station. I documented the timeline of sounds, the encounters with lost hikers, the footprints, the cave system, and the creature itself. I included as many specific details as I could remember: dimensions, behavior, the quality of the vocalizations, the texture of what I had observed. I did not expect anyone to believe me, but I documented it anyway because it seemed like the right thing to do. If I left without explanation, future rangers might come to Moloch Lake and encounter the creature without understanding what they were dealing with. My documentation might not convince anyone that the creature was real, but it might at least make them more aware, more cautious, more likely to take seriously their own instincts when those instincts told them something was wrong. I prepared to contact Robert via radio at the 7 o'clock check-in. I would tell him that I had experienced a medical emergency and needed immediate evacuation. The lie would spare me the necessity of trying to explain what I had actually encountered, and it would get me out of the station quickly. But the weather had other plans. The storm arrived in the late morning, coming from the north with a speed that seemed personally malevolent. Within minutes, the sky had darkened from clear autumn blue to a churning gray that blocked out the sun completely. The wind increased from manageable to dangerous, and the snow began to fall with intensity that suggested the storm was not going to be a passing event. I checked the radio. The signal was starting to break up, which meant the weather was already affecting conditions higher up in the passes. By evening, I knew radio contact would be impossible. By morning, the roads would be impassable. I was not leaving Moloch Lake today. I was not going to leave Moloch Lake for days, possibly weeks. The panic was immediate and intense. I stood in the cabin looking out the window at the snow accumulating already, at the visibility decreasing by the minute, and I felt something very close to despair. The universe was not going to cooperate with my escape. The forest was going to keep me here, and the creature that lived in the forest was now aware that I was its rival for territory, or its food, or something that occupied some role in its mental universe. I made the radio contact anyway, explaining the situation. Robert told me they would send someone once the storm cleared, but it might be several days. He told me to stay safe and maintain watch for emergencies. I confirmed, and the radio went to static. By evening, I could not see more than 10 feet from the cabin. The wind was constant and terrible, howling through the eaves and shaking the structure in ways that made me aware of how relatively fragile the cabin was. It was wood and insulation and human hope, sitting alone in a wilderness that did not care about human fragility. I did not hear the creature that night. The storm was too loud for me to hear anything, even if the creature had wanted to make itself known. But that was a different kind of terrible, because the silence of absence was replaced by the ignorance of unknowing. The creature was out there somewhere, displaced by the storm, perhaps taking shelter somewhere, perhaps coming closer to my cabin, perhaps already at my door. I sat through the night with lights on and a knife within reach, listening to the wind and the silence that lived within the wind. The next day, the storm was worse. The wind had developed a presence all its own, something that seemed to have intention and malice. The snow was not falling anymore so much as being driven horizontally by the wind, creating conditions where visibility was essentially zero. I could not see the station building, which was only 50 yards from the cabin. The forest had disappeared entirely, and in that storm, something began to go wrong with the cabin. The door on the northern side had developed a gap. I had not opened it, and the frame seemed sound, but there was a space between the door and the jamb that had not been there before. The gap was small, perhaps half an inch, but it was enough for a thin stream of snow to pour through, creating a white line on the floor of the cabin. I went to close it, to push it back into alignment, but it would not move. The frame itself seemed to be warping, as though the building was contracting and expanding in response to the temperature changes, as though the cabin itself was developing stress fractures from the assault of the storm. I had materials to seal the gap. I improvised weather stripping and stuffed it into the space, and that helped, but it did not stop the sense that the boundary between inside and outside was becoming more permeable. The storm was not just wind and snow, it was an assault on the very concept of shelter, on the assumption that walls and doors were sufficient to separate a human being from the wilderness. That night I heard the creature. The storm was still raging, still making visibility and most other forms of perception impossible. But the creature's sound cut through it. It came from very close, perhaps from directly against the northern side of the cabin, from the wall where the door was warping under the stress of wind and temperature changes. The sound it made was different from before. It was lower, more sustained. A sound like something trying to sing but not possessing the vocal cords for song. It was almost musical in its repetition and pattern, and it was absolutely terrible to hear. It suggested intelligence and intention and something like emotion, none of which I wanted to acknowledge or engage with. I moved to the window and peered out, but I could see nothing in the storm. Whatever was making the sound was invisible, hidden in the white chaos of wind and snow. The sound continued for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was so complete that I found myself questioning whether I had heard anything at all. But I knew I had heard it. I knew the creature was out there in the storm, and I knew that it knew I was here in my cabin, and I knew that the boundary between us was growing more and more permeable with each passing moment. The storm broke on the fourth day. The wind died down and the snow stopped, and the sun emerged from behind the clouds to find a landscape that had been completely transformed. The world was white and soft and beautiful in the way that snow can make things beautiful. The forest was buried under 3 feet of the stuff, and the paths I had walked so carefully had been erased entirely. The silence after the storm was profound. I went outside and stood in the snow, and I could hear nothing but wind in the distant high places and the occasional crack of wood or shift of snow somewhere in the forest. I walked around the cabin, examining it in daylight. The northern door had warped enough that I was not confident it would open in an emergency, but the frame had not failed. The cabin had held, but something in the snow near the cabin made me stop and stare. The footprints from the creature were there, right up against the cabin's wall. Not just one set of prints, but multiple sets, as though the creature had paced back and forth along the northern side throughout the storm. The prints were deep and wide, and they had not filled with snow, which meant they had been made recently, within hours at most. The creature had been right outside the cabin while I slept. It had walked the perimeter, pacing, testing, trying to determine if there was a way inside. The prints converged on the warped northern door, and there were deep gouges in the wood around the frame, marks where the creature had pried at the door with something that might have been claws or might have been fingers or might have been something that the creature had evolved specifically for this purpose. I stood looking at those marks, and I understood with absolute clarity that I was going to die here if I did not leave immediately. The roads were impassable. There was no way out by vehicle. Walking out in 3 feet of snow in autumn weather was a suicide mission that would accomplish nothing but prolonging my death. I was trapped. I went inside the cabin and began to prepare. I became methodical in a way that surprised me. Fear can motivate either paralysis or action, and I chose action because the alternative was unthinkable. I secured the cabin more carefully, building makeshift barriers for the doors and windows using materials from the station. I inventoried my food supplies, trying to calculate how long I could survive if I rationed carefully. I filled every container I had with water, understanding at some level that if the creature decided to cut my access to the lake or to the cabin's water line, I would need reserve supplies. I realized that I had already been living with this creature for nearly 3 months. I had survived this long. The isolation had prepared me for something, had hardened me in ways I was only now beginning to understand. I was no longer the same person who had arrived at Moloch Lake seeking solitude and escape. I had been transformed by the experience of proximity to something that violated all my assumptions about what the world contained. The radio functioned again once the storm cleared. I made contact with Robert at the scheduled time and told him that the cabin was intact but that heavy snow would make the roads impassable. He said they would send someone as soon as conditions allowed. I estimated that would be at least 3 to 5 days, possibly longer. Robert asked if I was safe. I told him yes, which was not exactly a lie. I was as safe as it was possible to be given the circumstances. The creature had not broken down the door. It had not attempted direct assault. It seemed content to pace, to test, to maintain its presence and its pressure. "You sure you're okay?" Robert asked. His voice over the radio had taken on a different quality. Something like genuine concern rather than administrative check-in. "I'm as okay as I can be," I said. "The cabin is secure. I have supplies. I'll be fine until the road clears." He seemed to accept this, though I could sense his reluctance in the static between our exchanges. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in the cabin with the lights on, and I read through the old ranger notes more carefully, trying to find something that might tell me how to survive the winter with a predatory creature pacing the perimeter of my shelter. The notes were sparse and often cryptic, but some patterns emerged. Ranger Kessler had written about seasonal patterns. The sounds and the activity increased in autumn when temperatures dropped, then tapered off as winter deepened. He theorized that the creature might go into some kind of hibernation or reduced activity period once snow covered the ground and food became scarce. If this was true, then the key was surviving the next few weeks, until the worst of the creature's seasonal aggression had passed. Another ranger from the 1970s had written about something called the watching. This ranger, whose name was partially illegible, described the experience of being constantly aware that something intelligent was observing him. The ranger had written that humans could adjust to the watching, that after a period of time the pressure of constant observation became normalized rather than terrifying. This ranger had lasted 8 months at the station, a record that suggested some form of adaptation was possible. I chose to believe these accounts. I chose to believe that I could survive this, that the creature's interest would eventually diminish, that winter would provide some natural respite from its aggression. I chose to believe that the surveillance and stalking was an alternative to violence, that the creature was testing the boundaries of my enclosure rather than preparing to breach them. The creature did not help my belief system along by doing anything to suggest it was satisfied with my continued existence. Over the next days, as the snow began to settle and compact, I found new evidence of the creature's activity. It had dug a trail along the eastern side of the cabin, a path that it traversed regularly, checking the windows and testing the door frames. It had marked the trees with gouges and scratches, creating a boundary that said this territory was occupied and observed. It had also left something that I initially could not identify: piles of bones and animal remains placed deliberately near the cabin's perimeter, as though making some kind of display. I realized that the creature was not just watching and waiting. It was communicating. It was telling me that this forest was its domain, that it had access to prey and food and resources, that it was not desperate or weakened. It was also telling me something else, something that took me longer to understand. It wanted me to know that I was being observed. The display was deliberate, calculated to trigger awareness and unease. By this logic, the creature was not immediately dangerous. A predator that wanted to kill something would not announce its presence so thoroughly, but a predator that wanted to establish dominance, that wanted to test limits, that wanted to understand the psychology of its rival or competitor. Such a predator might do exactly what this creature was doing. I began to think of it as a game, though a game with rules that I did not fully understand, and stakes that were objectively too high for any game to be valid. But by framing it as a game, I could maintain some sense of agency, some feeling that my actions had consequence and choice. The road was cleared on the 6th day after the storm. I heard the sound of an engine in the afternoon and went outside to see Robert's vehicle appearing through the trees. The relief I felt was complicated by the knowledge that Robert was about to see evidence of everything that had happened, that I would have to attempt to explain things that defied explanation. Robert stepped out of the vehicle with a frown of concern. He looked at me carefully, taking in my appearance. Thinner than I had been before, the line of exhaustion permanent across my face, the edge of something that might have been madness visible in my eyes. "You look terrible," he said. "It's been a rough few days," I said. "The storm was intense, and I've been dealing with something in the forest that I need to talk to you about." I showed Robert the evidence. I showed him the tracks in the snow, the gouges on the door frame, the bones displayed near the cabin. I showed him the cave system where the creature sheltered. I told him about Samantha's injury, about the sounds, about everything that I had documented in my meticulous notes. Robert listened, and I could see the doubt forming behind his eyes. He was trying to be supportive, trying to take me seriously, but he was also running through the mental process of evaluating whether I was having a psychological break. The isolation, the stress, the long dark nights of autumn, these things were known to affect people negatively. The possibility that I had misinterpreted natural phenomena was clearly occurring to him, but then I showed him the cave, and I showed him the den, and I showed him the evidence that something large and bipedal was living in the forest around Moloch Lake. The cave itself was impossible to dismiss. The arrangement of the space, the evidence of habituation, the smell that still hung in the stale air, these things could not be explained by imagination or stress. Robert was quiet for a long time. "How long have you been seeing this?" he asked finally. "Since September," I said. "But the creature has been here longer, much longer." The old ranger notes reference strange sounds and activity going back decades. Robert nodded slowly. "I need to file a report," he said. "I need to get wildlife biologists out here, to get people investigating. This is beyond my authority to handle." I felt a strange sense of relief mixed with a new kind of anxiety. The responsibility was now shared. I was no longer alone with this knowledge, but the investigation and the attention that would come with it was also going to bring outside people into this forest, and I was not sure they would survive the experience any better than I might. The investigation that followed was both exhaustive and ultimately inconclusive. Biologists and wildlife experts arrived within 2 days, along with a federal representative from the Park Service and local law enforcement. They examined the cave system, took samples, documented the tracks and the evidence. They set up motion sensor cameras and other monitoring equipment. They interviewed me extensively about every detail I could provide, and they found nothing that could be conclusively identified as non-human. The tracks were analyzed and determined to be consistent with a large bear, though the gait pattern was unusual. The bones in the cache were identified as elk and deer remains, nothing that suggested predation patterns outside the norm for a large carnivore. The cave itself was determined to be an old mining installation dating back over 100 years, modified by animal habitation but showing no signs of sentient occupation. The samples taken from the cave matched geological formations that were consistent with natural mineral deposits. Every piece of physical evidence was reinterpreted in a way that removed the necessity for anything extraordinary to exist. I watched this process with a strange mixture of frustration and relief. On one level, I wanted them to find irrefutable proof, to vindicate my experience and my sanity. On another level, I was grateful that the investigation did not find what it was looking for, because if it had found proof, if experts had confirmed the existence of the creature, then the next logical step would have been to capture or kill it. And I was no longer sure I wanted that. In the months I had spent at Moloch Lake, I had come to understand the creature not as an immediate threat but as a presence, a conscious awareness that occupied the same space I occupied. We were neighbors, in a sense, separated by walls and circumstance but coexisting. The creature had had multiple opportunities to kill me, and it had chosen not to. That choice might have been calculated, or it might have been based on some form of respect or recognition that humans existed in a different category from prey. Either way, the creature had tolerated my presence, and I had developed a reciprocal tolerance for its existence. The federal representative, a woman named Susan, was honest with me about the conclusions. "We can't find anything that would support your account," she said. "Not because I think you're lying, but because the physical evidence doesn't support the existence of an unknown species, or at least not a large one. Bears leave very distinctive signs. Everything we're finding is consistent with large bear activity, even if the pattern is a bit unusual." "What about the creature I saw in the cave?" I asked. "You saw it briefly in dim light. In a state of high stress and adrenaline," Susan said. "The human brain is very good at recognizing faces and humanoid shapes. The visual cortex is primed to see patterns that might not actually be present." It was a reasonable explanation. It was also completely wrong. But I understood that I could not convince her otherwise. The creature existed in a space that was beyond the reach of conventional investigation, beyond the ability of scientific method to confirm. "What do you want to do?" Susan asked. "Do you want to continue at this station, or do you want to transfer?" I thought about the long winter ahead, about the isolation and the darkness and the creature pacing in the forest. I thought about being pulled out of Moloch Lake, about returning to civilization and regular society, about pretending that the last 3 months had been a form of temporary madness brought on by isolation. "I want to stay," I said. At least for the winter. I can re-evaluate in spring. Susan looked surprised, but she did not argue. A transfer could be arranged if I changed my mind, she said. In the meantime, she would recommend that the station be regularly monitored, that equipment be left behind for wildlife observation. The investigation ended 3 days after it had begun. The experts packed up their equipment and their inconclusive findings and drove away, returning to a world where things made sense according to the categories that science had established. Robert stopped by one final time to see if I needed anything before the winter roads became too treacherous for regular traffic. "You're sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," I said. After Robert left, I stood outside the cabin and looked at the forest that was beginning to prepare for the long winter. The snow had thawed partially and then refrozen, creating a crust that would persist through the season. The trees stood dark and patient, waiting for the months of deep cold. The creature did not approach the cabin for several days after the investigation concluded. I understood that this was a form of retreat, a recognition that the presence of other humans had changed the terms of whatever relationship was developing between us. When the creature did resume its nightly vocalizations, there was a different quality to the sounds, less aggressive, more contemplative, as though it had also processed the visit of the investigators and come to some form of understanding. The autumn gradually gave way to early winter, and the days became progressively shorter and colder. Snow accumulated regularly, burying the tracks and the evidence and the displays that the creature had made. The creature's activity, as the old ranger notes had predicted, began to diminish. The visits to the cabin's perimeter became less frequent. The sounds grew less intense. By December, the creature seemed to have entered some form of dormancy. There were nights when I heard nothing at all from the forest, when the silence was complete and profound. I continued to document everything, continued to keep the cabin secure, continued to prepare for emergency. But the edge of fear that had driven me through the autumn began to soften into something more like acceptance. I had survived. The creature had allowed me to survive. And now, in the darkness and cold of winter, we would both endure. On the first truly cold night in December, when the temperature dropped to 15 degrees and the stars were visible with absolute clarity, I heard the creature make its sound one final time. It came from far away, from somewhere deep in the forest, a single long vocalization that lasted perhaps 10 seconds. It was not a threat or a challenge. It was something closer to a farewell. I stood outside the cabin in the bitter cold, and I listened to that sound fade into the winter night, and I understood with a certainty that I could not explain or justify that I had been chosen by the creature not as prey or rival, but as a witness. I had been given the gift of seeing, of knowing that the world contained mysteries and strangeness beyond the categories that civilization had established. When spring came and the roads became passable, Robert would drive out to the station. He would find me alive and intact. He would ask if I still wanted the transfer, and I would tell him that I did not. I would tell him that I had made peace with Moloch Lake, that I understood now why it was a place where human rangers came and went, why people could not quite explain the feeling of being watched and observed, why solitude in these mountains was a form of conversation with something that existed just beyond the reach of understanding. I would tell him that some places were meant to be inhabited by two consciousnesses simultaneously, separated by the thinnest of boundaries, learning from each other in ways that had nothing to do with words or sounds. And I would stay at Moloch Lake for another season, and another after that, documenting the creature's behavior, learning its patterns, becoming something other than human and something more than alone. The forest keeps its secrets, and I had become the keeper of one of them. I took the ranger position at Mammoth Hot Springs because I needed to disappear. Not from the law, nothing dramatic like that. I needed distance from people who knew my face, my failures, my ex-wife's accusations that I'd become someone unrecognizable. At 37, I'd burned through 2 careers and a marriage. The National Park Service offered something I hadn't found in cities, the luxury of being alone with competence. Out here, a broken person could still fix things, could still be useful. My name is Marcus Webb. I've worked 9 years in Yellowstone now, 5 of those stationed at Clearwater Cabin, a ranger outpost 40 miles northeast of the main park facilities, accessible only by foot or ATV. The cabin sits on the edge of Highlight Lake, where the wilderness deepens into genuine isolation. In winter it becomes unreachable. In summer it's a quiet kingdom of lodgepole pines and thermal vents that smell like sulfur and thyme. I'm writing this account because people need to understand what exists in the spaces between mapped trails. Because what happened in October should never be forgotten or repeated. The first sign was the ravens. I'd been alone at Clearwater for 3 weeks. October had arrived with teeth, frost crackling grass at dawn, the sky turning that particular shade of blue that only happens when winter circles the perimeter. My work involved trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, and answering the occasional lost hiker's satellite phone call. That year had been routine. Grizzlies were denning up, the elk herds moved through their ancient patterns, the lake reflected clouds like it had for 10,000 years. The ravens changed everything. They came from the north, dozens of them, moving with an oddness I couldn't immediately name. Ravens are common here, clever, aggressive birds that follow hikers for dropped food. These ones didn't scavenge. They gathered in the silver birches across the lake, silent in a way that made my shoulders tighten. I watched them through my cabin window for an hour. They didn't feed, didn't call, just existed in the trees, wings folded, heads angled toward the cabin. By evening, they'd vanished. I thought nothing of it. Wildlife does strange things. But that night, I heard the first sound from the Eastern Trail, a long, drawn-out call that wasn't quite animal. It came from somewhere past the tree line, a vocalization between a bugle and something else, something almost intentional in its weirdness. Elk don't sound like that. Wolves don't sound like that. It carried across the lake with an acoustic quality that suggested something massive, something near the thermal vents where steam rises and distorts distance. I stood on the cabin porch at 2 a.m. listening. The temperature had dropped to 20 degrees. My breath came in plumes. The sound didn't repeat. The next morning, I found tracks. They were in the soft earth near my water pump, pressed deep enough that the frost hadn't crystallized the impressions. The shape troubled me immediately. Too large for a bear, nearly 18 inches across, but the weight distribution was wrong, the spacing suggesting something bipedal. Elk hooves left sharp marks. These were rounded, almost pad-like. I photographed them with my Ranger phone and emailed the images to district office. The response came back within hours. Probably bear, possibly black bear standing on hind legs, common around water sources, keep normal protocols. Flag for next patrol. Normal protocols. That phrase would haunt me later. By mid-October, I'd documented 7 more incidents that the district office classified as routine. A sulfur smell so strong it made my eyes water despite the vents being 5 miles south. Knocking sounds on the cabin at night. Methodical, patient, as if something were testing the structure. Scratch marks appearing on the outer wall in patterns that seemed deliberate. The worst was the silence. The north end of the lake became a dead zone. The water birds that typically clustered there, loons, mergansers, grebes, had vanished. The acoustic property of the lake usually meant I heard their calls echoing across the water at dusk. In mid-October, the northern half simply went quiet, soundless, unnatural in a way that made the back of my neck prickle. I began hiking the Eastern Trail daily, searching for the source of that bugle call. The forest there is dense, century-old pines creating a canopy that blocks sunlight, with thermal features scattered throughout that I wasn't fully mapping. The park contains over 10,000 thermal features. Most are cataloged, some aren't. On October 19th, I found something that changed my understanding of the situation. It was a kill site about 2 miles out near the geysers that steam in winter. A moose recently killed, but the details of its death were wrong. The animal's torso was opened vertically, not the result of predator feeding. The bear kills from the back or sides. Wolves bring down prey with the legs. This was surgical in its precision, one sustained wound from neck to pelvis, as if something with a single curved talon had disemboweled the creature. There were no tracks around it. In mud this soft, with an animal this size, there should have been evidence of circling, of the predator's approach. Instead, there was only the kill itself, isolated and stageful, like a message placed deliberately where I'd find it. I called it in. The district sent a veterinary tech out 2 days later. He examined the carcass, took samples, and made a measurement that stuck with me. Claw span, if there was one, would be about 4 feet. He said, his voice flat in a way that suggested he'd seen something incomprehensible. Assuming a single tool, he didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. That night, I sat in the cabin with all the windows locked and the door barred. I have a good rifle, a .308 Winchester that I maintain for park protection. I loaded it and placed it across the table. I didn't expect it would help. The sound came at 11 p.m. It was different from the bugle call. This was inside my head somehow, a sensation rather than a noise, a weight pressing down on my skull, a frequency so low it registered as pressure rather than sound. It lasted maybe 30 seconds. When it stopped, I realized I was on the floor, nose bleeding, my hands gripping the table leg so hard my knuckles had gone white. I didn't leave. That's what I want to be clear about. I had the option. I could have hiked out, flagged a passing ranger, requisitioned emergency extraction. I didn't. Some part of me, the part that had been running from responsibility for 7 years, needed to understand what lived here. The creature, if that's what it was intelligent. That became obvious by October 25th. It had learned my routines. I'd wake at 6 a.m., start coffee, check the morning log. Between 6:15 and 6:45, I'd be inside, visible through the eastern window. That's when it would vocalize, not the bugle call anymore, but something different. A sound like wind through a canyon, like wolves calling from miles away, but wrong in some indefinable way. It was testing my reactions, I understood, learning how I responded. I started varying my routine. I'd skip breakfast, or move around the cabin, or go outside at odd hours. Each time the creature adjusted. The calls would come at different times. The knocking on the walls happened when I was in the bathroom, when I was in the kitchen, when I'd positioned myself where I shouldn't be visible. It was mapping the cabin's interior layout. The ranger station maintained a detailed logbook. I'd kept one for 9 years. Weather, wildlife observations, maintenance tasks. I began writing everything down. Not the official observations for the district, but private notes. A record. October 27th. Heard it on the western ridge. Got within maybe 200 yards. Circled back to the cabin. Smell came with it. Not the sulfur smell, something else. Like rot, but fresher. Like something bleeding internally and still moving. October 29th. Stood outside for an hour this morning. The whole forest was quiet. Not normal quiet. Predator quiet. Everything hiding. When I finally went inside, I found a feather on the porch. Raven feather, about 14 inches. Too large. Ravens don't have feathers that size. October 31st. It was at the lake. Watching. I could feel its attention on me like weight. Didn't see it, but I felt it the way you feel someone staring at you in a dark room. Went to the water pump for the first time in 3 days and my hands shook so badly I spilled everything. By early November I understood I was being hunted in the traditional sense, not for food, for curiosity. The creature was evaluating whether I was a threat or an opportunity. Everything it did was a test. They arrived on November 3rd, a couple from Bozeman, early 30s, completely lost. They'd taken a trail marked as closed for maintenance and ended up 4 miles off course. The woman was injured, a bad ankle, and they had maybe 2 hours of daylight left. By all protocol, I should have radioed the district, sent them to wait at a ranger station 10 miles out, called in an official extraction. I didn't. I told them they could stay at the cabin overnight. I told them we'd make the hike out together in the morning when it was safer. The woman, whose name was Rebecca, seemed relieved. Her boyfriend Marcus, coincidentally, was less comfortable with the arrangement. He kept looking around the cabin like he expected something to jump from the shadows. "Is this safe?" he asked me, not bothering to lower his voice. "Being out here alone? Safer than being lost in the dark," I said. He didn't disagree. I should have sent them away. That's what I've told myself 1,000 times. But I needed witnesses. I needed someone to confirm what was happening, because I was beginning to doubt my own perception. The creature came that night. It didn't attack, it circled the cabin. We heard it moving around the perimeter, deliberate and slow, not trying to hide, making sure we knew it was there. The knocking was louder than usual, harder, the impacts actually shifting the cabin walls. Rebecca clung to Marcus. I stood at the window watching the darkness, understanding that whatever boundary existed between the forest and civilization had become permeable. Around midnight, something happened that I'll never fully explain. The creature vocalized directly at the window where I was standing. The sound came from outside the glass, close enough that I could see breath fogging the pane. It was different from every other noise. It was, without question, an attempt at speech. The vocalization had the cadence and structure of language, syllables, emphasis, something almost like words. It lasted maybe 10 seconds. I didn't understand the language, but I understood the intention. It was answering me. Every observation I'd made, every private note I'd written, every time I'd stood outside and wondered what lived in this forest, it had understood. And now it was answering, not in English, in something older, something that belonged to the forest before names existed for places like Yellowstone. Rebecca screamed. The sound broke whatever spell had taken hold. The creature withdrew from the window. We heard it retreat into the trees, moving faster now, less interested in patience. "We need to leave," Marcus said. His voice was thin, shaking. "Right now. Tonight." I considered it. With an injured woman, it was a bad idea. With whatever lived out there, it was suicide. I made a decision that still haunts me. In the morning, I said, we'll be safer in daylight. Morning came slow. November 4th arrived, gray and cold, the sky the color of old concrete. I made coffee. We ate in silence, me watching the windows, Marcus watching me, Rebecca trying not to put weight on her ankle. At 8 a.m. I told them to pack. We'd hike out. The trail would take maybe 5 hours. The creature had been absent all night, and I chose to interpret that as permission. We made it maybe 1.5 miles. The forest changes when you're being hunted. Distances become misleading. The trail that I'd hiked 100 times became labyrinthine. Turns that should have been obvious became confusing. I kept losing direction, then finding it again. Marcus kept asking if I was sure about the route. I wasn't. We were 3 miles in. I was sure of that from the landmarks. When we found the clearing, I didn't remember it from my maps. It was roughly circular, 200 feet across, with all the undergrowth and deadfall cleared as if by hand. In the center was a deer, not a dead deer, a live one, standing motionless, staring directly at us. Except it wasn't standing right. The back legs were reversed, the joints bending wrong, the hooves pointing backward. The front legs were extended too far, the proportions stretched thin. But the eyes were the worst part. They tracked us with intelligence, with purpose, with an awareness that no animal should possess. Rebecca made a choking sound. Marcus grabbed her arm. "That's not a deer," he whispered. The not deer stepped toward us. I raised my rifle. The safety was already off, had been since we left the cabin. I could drop it with one shot. I wanted to. Something in my hindbrain screamed to shoot, but I didn't. A sound came from the forest on the eastern edge of the clearing. The creature, not vocalizing this time, just moving, breaking branches, displacing air, announcing its presence with the confidence of something that had never known prey that could fight back effectively. It emerged between two massive firs. I've spent years trying to describe what I saw. The human mind resists certain categories of experience. There are things evolution never prepared us to process. This was one of them. The creature was roughly 7 feet tall, but that measurement doesn't capture it. It had the fundamental structure of something ape-like, arms too long, frame too wide, but it was wrong in every specific detail. The skin, where it was visible, had the texture of something mummified, stretched and cracked. The face had too many angles, proportions that shifted depending on the angle I viewed it from. The eyes were vertical slits, the mouth too wide, the teeth visible even when closed. Teeth that seemed to number in the dozens. But the worst was the smell. It came in waves, a stench of carrion and something chemical, something that belonged in an industrial facility rather than a forest. It made my eyes water, made my lungs close against the impulse to vomit. The creature looked at me. I felt its attention like a physical force. Years of self-analysis, of shame, of running, it all seemed insignificant in that moment. I was prey. I was observed. I was understood in a way I'd never wanted to be understood. It moved toward us. I fired. The shot was loud in the clearing, impossibly loud. The creature didn't react. The bullet hit it somewhere in the chest cavity. I'm certain it did. The rifle bucked correctly. My aim was true. The creature continued moving. No blood, no wound, no acknowledgement that it had been struck. I fired again. Then again. The creature didn't accelerate. It didn't attack. It walked toward us with the patient inevitability of inevitable things. Rebecca was screaming now, a sound that went on and on without breath. Marcus was pulling her backward, stumbling, falling, dragging her toward the trail. I kept firing. I don't remember the exact moment my understanding shifted. Somewhere between the 5th and 6th shots I understood that the creature was allowing this, that the rifle was as relevant as a toothpick would be against a bear, that my fear, my bullets, my desperate animal instinct to fight, all of it was entertainment. The creature stopped 10 feet from me. I was out of bullets. I knew this with absolute certainty. I could feel the emptiness of the magazine like a hollow in my chest. The creature knew it too. It had been counting. It had been watching my body language, my trigger finger, my empty chamber clicks. It vocalized, not the bugle call, not the attempted speech. This was something else. This was the sound of certainty. The sound of something that knows the outcome of a situation with the precision of a theorem. The not deer was gone. I don't know when it disappeared. The clearing was empty except for me and the creature and the weight of 100 years of isolation that suddenly felt intentional. "Take them," I said. The words came out dry, cracked, like something speaking after a decade of silence. The creature's head angled, its vertical slit eyes narrowed further. "Take them and leave me," I said. I'll stay. You go. Time does strange things in moments of negotiation with the incomprehensible. A second felt like an hour. The creature was evaluating, actually considering. I could feel its intelligence pressing against mine like thoughts in a shared skull. It moved, not toward me, toward the trail where Marcus was pulling Rebecca. I stepped between them, rifle raised, knowing the gesture was meaningless. The creature stopped, waited, and then, with a deliberation that I understand only now, it turned back toward the northern forest. It walked away, each footfall shaking the earth, until the trees swallowed it and the smell began to fade. I stood in the clearing for maybe 5 minutes. My hands were shaking. My vision had tunneled to a point of absolute focus. Then I ran. I caught up with Marcus and Rebecca maybe a quarter mile down the trail. They were moving fast, Rebecca limping badly, Marcus supporting her weight. I didn't explain, I just urged them faster. We made the lodge at 4 p.m., the district office at 6. The extraction helicopter by 8. Rebecca's ankle healed fine. Marcus wrote a scathing review online about the park's ranger services. The district office opened an official investigation into my mental fitness. Psychological evaluation suggested stress-induced hallucinations, though the evaluator seemed uncomfortable with that diagnosis. They offered me a transfer. I accepted. I'm at Grand Teton now, 18 miles away, but it might as well be another dimension. I don't go back to Clearwater. I don't hike past the ranger station boundary. I maintain protocols, fill out forms, and do my job with the professionalism that the service requires. But sometimes, on nights when the wind comes from the north, I remember the clearing. I remember the creature's eyes. I remember the exact moment I understood that some things are older than maps, older than the concept of wilderness or civilization. I remember understanding that I made the only choice available to someone who'd already run out of places to hide. The creature, whatever its name is, whatever language it speaks, knows where to find me. And I know, with absolute certainty, that it will. Not tonight, not next month, but eventually, when some invisible debt comes due, when the understanding between us reaches its conclusion. I took this job to disappear. I think it took me to show that disappearing is impossible, that the wild doesn't exist outside civilization. It exists inside us. And when you run far enough north, deep enough into the forest, you finally meet yourself. You finally meet the thing you've been running from all along. It's always waiting. The offer came to me on a March afternoon when I was working construction in Missoula, pulling nails from rotting deckboards with my hands bleeding and my back making sounds like gravel shifting. 32 years old, no degree, no family to speak of, and a philosophy that had served me well. When something hurts, find something different. The ranger position at Glacier National Park seemed like the kind of different that would heal something I couldn't name. My name is Marcus Webb. I've never been one for ceremony or introduction, so I'll just say that I took the job because I needed to disappear into something larger than myself. The money was modest, the isolation was the real draw. Glacier offered all of that, along with a cabin near Lake Saya, 8 miles north of the main lodge, accessible only by foot or horse for most of the year. The interviewer was a woman named Iris Beckett, weathered and direct in the way that people who spend their lives in mountains tend to be. She didn't ask many questions about my past, which suggested she'd worked with enough people running from something to know that asking was pointless. What she wanted to know was whether I could handle loneliness, whether I could manage emergency response alone, whether I understood that help was never less than 4 hours away, and whether I was prepared for the reality that people who came to beautiful places sometimes did foolish things. I said yes to all of it. I meant yes to all of it. The cabin sat on a rise above the lake, a structure built in 1987 that had weathered 3 decades of Montana winters with grace. The walls were logs, thick enough to absorb sound. The roof was metal, good for shedding snow. Inside there was a wood stove that actually worked, a cot with a decent mattress, a small kitchen with a gas stove, and a radio that connected to the main station if the weather cooperated. I arrived in May when the trails were still muddy and the lake ice was just memory. The work was exactly what the job description promised: maintaining trail markers, responding to lost hikers, conducting bear safety briefings, watching for fires, documenting wildlife, making sure people didn't wander into places that wanted to kill them. It was work that filled the day without requiring speech. It was work that let me exist. For the first 3 months, nothing was strange. The hikers came, mostly families and experienced backpackers who knew the mountains and respected them. I helped an elderly couple who'd taken a wrong turn near Eagle Pass. I found a lost German tourist near Gunsight Lake who had become disorientated in fog. I documented a healthy grizzly population, filed reports on trail conditions, and went to bed each night with the kind of tiredness that meant sleep came without argument. The mountains that surrounded Lake Saye were old, weathered down into their most honest shapes. They didn't pretend to be anything but what they were. There was something restful in that clarity. I began to understand why people came here, why they risked their safety to touch something so large and indifferent. In August, I met Marcus Reed, the ranger who covered the southern section of the park. He came by the cabin to review the summer reports, arriving on a horse that looked as tired as he did. He was older than me, maybe 60, with the kind of face that had spent a lifetime squinting into weather. "You settling in okay?" he asked, not really asking, more like verifying that I hadn't killed myself yet. "Fine," I said. "Quiet up here," he nodded, sitting at my small table with coffee I'd made strong enough to strip paint. "It gets quieter," he said. "By October you won't see many people. By November you'll be the only soul for miles. Some people can't handle that." "I can handle it." He looked at me for a moment in a way that suggested he was measuring something. "There's something you should know," he said finally. "It's probably nothing, but you should know it anyway. About a month ago, one of the hiking guides reported something unusual near CA Pass. Said she saw movement in the trees at dusk, something that moved wrong, like it was copying the way a hiker moved, but the rhythm was off." "Off how?" I asked. "She couldn't describe it well, just said it wasn't natural. The gait was wrong, the proportions seemed wrong when she caught them in the light." He sipped his coffee. "We sent rangers out, found nothing. Could have been a bear standing briefly upright, could have been a trick of light, could have been nothing at all." "But you don't think it was nothing," I said. "I think that woman wasn't prone to seeing things that weren't there. And I think that around here, in late summer and fall, people sometimes notice things they can't quite explain. Things that don't fit into the normal categories." I didn't press him on what those categories might be. I understood that some information was volunteered because the speaker needed it acknowledged, not because it was meant to be acted upon. After he left, I stood on the porch of the cabin and looked out across the lake. The water was mirror still, reflecting the mountains in perfect detail. The peak of Stimson rose above everything else, a dark triangle against the sky. I listened to the sound of the forest in late afternoon. Birds moving through branches, wind in the canopy, water lapping at the shore. It was a full sound, but it was the sound of things being where they belonged. I didn't think much about what Marcus Reed had told me. I'd learned early that people who lived close to wild places accumulated stories the way others collected news. The stories were a way of processing the continuous low-level fear that came from sharing space with forces that didn't care whether you lived or died. But I kept it in mind. In a way I couldn't fully articulate, I kept it in mind. September arrived with a change in quality. The light became sharper, the shadows deeper. The tourists thinned out. The trail traffic that had been constant through the summer dropped away until days passed between encounters with other humans. This was what I'd wanted, this silence. But now that I had it, I understood that silence was not empty. Silence was full of things paying attention. The first strange report came on September 8th. A hiker named Vincent Moreau came down from the pass around 6 in the evening with his teenage daughter. They were supposed to have summited and descended the same day, but they'd moved slower than planned. When he radioed ahead to request an escort down the dark final stretch of trail, he asked specifically for me. I met them at the junction of the Sia Pass Trail with the main path. In the failing light, Vincent looked exhausted in a way that wasn't simply physical. "Did something happen?" I asked. He looked at his daughter, then back at me. "We saw something up there, around 2 in the afternoon near the pass." He paused and I could see him trying to find the words. There was another hiker ahead of us. At least that's what I thought at first. Another person moving up the trail. "That happens," I said. "Not like this. This person, the movement was different. I can't explain it. The way their legs bent when they walked, the way their arms moved. It was like watching someone move in the wrong way." The person we were watching was wearing a dark jacket and light pants, and I remember thinking I wanted to catch up and see if they needed anything. But then they turned and looked back at us. I waited. "Their face was wrong," Vincent said. "I only saw it for a second before they turned away and moved off the trail into the trees. But the face didn't match the body. It was too wide, and the features were all wrong. And they moved fast, really fast. Faster than any person should be able to run downhill over rocks." His daughter was looking at her shoes. The whole encounter had shaken them both, that much was clear. "Did you see anything else?" I asked. "No. But we heard something about 20 minutes later, behind us. Something moving through the brush alongside the trail. Whatever it was, it didn't stay on the path. I walked them down the mountain and didn't offer explanations or reassurance. Reassurance would have been insulting. Instead, I listened to the sounds of the forest and my own breathing and tried not to think about what moved beside the trail in the darkness. When I got back to the cabin after midnight, I made an entry in the incident log. The entry was brief and professional, the kind of language that would be easily dismissed if someone reading it months later needed a reason to dismiss it. Hiker report of unusual movement on CA Pass Trail. Likely wildlife. No signs of hazard found. I didn't sleep well that night. The cabin seemed smaller than usual, and the walls seemed to contain rather than protect. I lay in the cot and listened to wind moving through the trees and tried to think of reasonable explanations for a face too wide, for movement that bent the wrong way, for something that moved faster than anything should move while pretending to be a hiker. By the following week, there were 3 more reports. A trail maintenance crew saw something watching them from the tree line near Saya Pass, something that looked almost human until it moved too quickly across a boulder field. A couple camping near Lake Ellen Wilson reported that something came to the edge of their camp around midnight, something that stood on 2 legs and was silent but breathing, until they shouted and it vanished into the darkness with no sound at all. A solo backpacker described seeing his own figure ahead of him on the trail, perfect in every detail except that when he caught up there was nothing there. The reports were fragmentary, and each one could be dismissed individually, but together they created a pattern. Something was moving through the park that knew how to approximate human shape, but couldn't quite get the details right. Something that could watch, and wait, and follow, that moved with an efficiency that nothing natural seemed to possess. I began checking the equipment in the cabin more carefully. The rifle was a .30-06, old but reliable. There were 12 shells, which seemed both like too many and too few. I had a good knife, a compass, a map marked with detailed elevation changes and water sources. I started sleeping with the rifle within reach. On September 18th, I found something that made my stomach tighten in a way that fear alone couldn't account for. On a section of trail 2 miles from the cabin, there were tracks in the soft ground. I'd seen plenty of bear tracks, elk tracks, mountain lion tracks. These were different. They were almost human, 5-toed, with an arch and a heel, but the proportions were wrong. The stride was too long. The depth suggested a weight distribution that didn't match anything natural, but worse than the shape of them was the evidence of the pattern. The tracks followed the trail for about a quarter mile, but not in the way an animal follows a trail. It was like they were duplicating the pattern of hiker footprints, learning the shape of how human beings moved, and then, where the trail crossed a clear space of rock, the tracks simply stopped. There was no sign of what direction it had gone after that, only a space where nothing had set foot. I reported it the same way I reported the hiker sightings, officially, carefully, in language that made it sound like nothing unusual. But I also drove up to the main station and talked to Iris Beckett in person. The prints were unusual, I said. She was sitting behind a desk with paperwork that seemed to multiply like a curse. Unusual how? Almost human. But not quite right, I hesitated. And there's a pattern to the sightings. They're happening in specific locations. Sia Pass, the trails that lead up to the high passes. It's like something is learning the geography. Learning? She set down her pen. That's an odd choice of word. I can't think of a better one. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in 1952, a ranger named James Garrison reported similar incidents. He was stationed at the North Cabin, the one we demolished in 1994. He documented what he called imitative behavior in wildlife. Said he observed what he thought was a cougar, but the movement was wrong. It was mimicking something else. He went into his report that he believed something in the park wasn't following normal predator patterns. What happened? I asked. He quit in 1954. Said the park had gotten into his head. Got a job in administration down in Denver and never came back. She looked at me. He didn't mention anything worse than strange animal behavior. I'm not saying there is anything worse, I said. No. But you're thinking it. I left it at that. October came with a hardness in the air and a quality to the light that made the mountains look simultaneously more beautiful and more ominous. The leaves in the valley turned color in waves, gold and red bleeding across the landscape. The temperature dropped enough that morning frost stayed on the ground until nearly noon. The hiking season was effectively over. The park cleared out. The tourists funneled back to their normal lives, and the mountains became the province of rangers and locals, and the things that lived here year-round. I was alone in a way I had been seeking, but not in the way I'd imagined. The sightings had increased, not in frequency, but in boldness. Something was becoming less careful about being seen. On October 3rd, a hiker reported that something had walked through their camp in broad daylight, moving between tents in a way that was almost casual. It wore the shape of a person, but it didn't move like one. The hiker had grabbed a tent pole and started hitting it, and it had run, but not in panic. It had run with a kind of purposeful stride, like it was withdrawing from a situation it had calculated and decided to leave. On October 7th, I saw it. I was walking the trail toward Sia Pass in late afternoon, doing a routine check for hazards and maintenance issues. The weather was clear, the light was still good, and I had no reason to think today would be different from 100 other days. I was maybe 3 miles up the trail, approaching the steeper section where the path narrows and the altitude starts to matter, when I heard something moving in the trees to my left. I stopped. The sound had been wrong from the first instant I heard it. It wasn't the way a bear moves through brush, or an elk, or anything else I'd encountered. It was too deliberate, too controlled. Branches broke not from careless passage but in a way that suggested something stepping carefully over obstacles it could have gone around. I put my hand on the knife at my belt, not sure why. A knife seemed absurdly inadequate against whatever was moving parallel to the trail, but the gesture was automatic. I was alone, miles from help, and something was walking through the forest in a way that nothing natural walked. Then it stepped out onto the trail. It was roughly human in shape, which was perhaps the worst part of it. It had 2 legs and 2 arms, a torso, a head. The proportions were almost right, close enough that my brain wanted to categorize it as human, but every detail was wrong. The joints bent slightly too far. The arms were a little too long. The head sat on the neck at an angle that suggested the muscles underneath were arranged differently than they should be, and the face was a copy that had been made by something that had only a theoretical understanding of human faces. The features were distributed correctly, but they didn't align in a way that created expression. The mouth was there, but it didn't move the way mouths move. The eyes were looking at me with a kind of focused attention that I'd never seen in any animal, and that attention was worse than aggression. It was the attention of something cataloging, observing, trying to understand. It was wearing clothes, dark hiking pants and a gray fleece jacket and hiking boots. It was wearing the clothes of someone who had been on the trail, someone who belonged here. "Don't move," I heard myself say, which was perhaps the stupidest thing I could have said. The figure didn't move anyway. It just stood there, 30 feet away, looking at me with that perfectly wrong face. Then it tried to smile. The mouth opened, but the smile went wrong. Too many teeth. No, not too many. Arranged wrong. The wrong kind of teeth in the wrong kind of mouth. And the muscles didn't move right. It was like watching something pull its own face into a shape it had seen in photographs but didn't understand. I drew the knife. The thing's head tilted. Just tilted, a movement of curiosity. Then it moved toward me. I don't remember the next few seconds clearly. I remember yelling. I remember running. I remember the sound of it running behind me, that same controlled, purposeful pace. Not the chaotic rush of a predator, but the steady pursuit of something that had decided on a course of action and was following through. I didn't look back. I ran down the trail, my lungs burning, my legs pumping, and the sound of it behind me never changed, never accelerated, never slowed. Just that steady, patient pace, like it was matching my rhythm, learning how fast I could move. The trail descended sharply, and I took it recklessly, nearly falling twice, catching myself on rocks and branches. And then I was off the trail entirely, crashing through brush and deadfall, moving down the mountainside in the direction of the cabin, even though I was too far up, too far away, and there was nothing that would help me once darkness came. The sound behind me changed. It stopped being the sound of something running on the trail. Now it was moving through the forest, and that movement was efficient in a way that my panicked scrambling was not. It wasn't running upright anymore, I could tell that from the sound. It was moving on all fours now, moving the way something should move through terrain like this. I kept running. I made it to the cabin as darkness was falling, my lungs shredded, my legs barely functional. I locked the door and threw the bolt and stood in the darkness, trying to breathe, trying to think. Outside, the forest was quiet. Whatever I'd been running from was gone, or was waiting, or was patient enough to not rush. I didn't turn on lights. I sat on the floor with my back against the door and the knife in my hand and the rifle across my lap, and I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. It had been a person, but not a person. It had been wearing human clothes. It had been trying to smile. It had been following, learning, calculating, and it had been real. Not a hallucination, not an optical illusion, not a bear in a weird posture. It had been real, and I had seen it, and that fact changed everything about what I thought I knew about the mountains. The next morning came gray and cold. with clouds moving in from the west. I opened the cabin door carefully, standing well back from the opening, ready to slam it shut. The porch was empty. The ground around the cabin showed no signs of activity, but that meant nothing. Something that could move the way this thing moved, could hide in ways that would leave no evidence. I needed help. The thought of calling Iris Beckett was paralyzing, but the alternative was waiting alone in a cabin while something that knew where I was decided to try again. The radio crackled to life when I switched it on. I reported a disturbance, gave coordinates, and used the phrase potential wildlife threat with the kind of bureaucratic calmness that made it sound like a bear in the garbage rather than something that had tried to study my face up close. Iris arrived with a state wildlife officer named Paul Hennessy, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who'd seen enough dead things to be unsurprised by anything alive. They came by horse, arriving at the cabin just after noon. I described what I'd seen using the same careful language I'd been using in all my reports. Not a person, but not an animal either. Unusual behavior, moving wrong. Show us where it happened, Paul said, and we headed back up the trail. There was nothing to show. The forest looked as it always looked. No tracks, no damage, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Paul moved through the area with a professional attention to detail, but I could see him becoming skeptical. This was a man who dealt in physical evidence, scat, prints, blood, damage. He had no framework for what I was describing. "You're sure about what you saw?" he asked. "Yes." "Could it have been a hiker? Someone in unusual clothing, moving in a way you found disorienting?" Its face was wrong. The whole thing was wrong. He nodded. The kind of nod that meant he was filing this in the category of things he'd heard from people who'd spent too long alone in the wilderness. People saw things, people under stress, people isolated, people in extreme environments. People started to see patterns that weren't there. "We can increase patrols," he said finally. "But I'm not finding anything that suggests a genuine threat." Iris and I walked them back down the mountain. After they left, she took me aside. "There's something I didn't tell you before," she said. "Something that might help you understand what's happening. In the 1970s, we had an issue with poachers. Not just hunting out of season, but taking things they shouldn't have been taking. Eagle feathers, bear bones. Things that the Blackfeet tribe considered sacred. A poacher was found near the cabin you're staying in now. He'd been severely mauled, like by a cougar, but the circumstances were strange. He was positioned carefully, almost ritually. The tribal elders who came to the site said it looked like something had been teaching the forest to protect itself." "What does that mean?" I asked. "I'm not entirely sure, but I know that the Blackfeet have stories about skinwalkers, about things that wear stolen faces and walk the high places. I know that those stories have been around for centuries, long before Europeans came to this part of the world. And I know that people who spend their entire lives learning to read the mountains take those stories seriously." "Are you telling me that what I saw was a skinwalker?" I heard the disbelief in my own voice, which was strange because the disbelief seemed less reasonable than the acceptance. "I'm telling you that I've read enough accounts from people I trust to know that something moves through these mountains that doesn't fit into official categories. I'm telling you that trying to explain it through wildlife biology alone has never worked. And I'm telling you that you need to take whatever you saw seriously, not because I believe in folklore, but because something real scared you badly enough that you ran through rough terrain and fading light." I didn't know what to say to that. The mountains around us looked exactly as they always had. Beautiful and ancient and indifferent. Nothing about them suggested that they contained mysteries or that reality worked differently at higher altitudes. But then again, reality often suggested that until the moment it stopped. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on the porch with the rifle and watched the darkness and tried to think. The thing I'd encountered had been learning. It had been collecting information about how humans moved, how they looked, how they reacted. It had been studying me the way I might have studied an animal, with a focused intensity that suggested a mind behind the observation. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something at the edge of the clearing. Not the sound of something approaching, but the sound of something being present, observing, waiting. I didn't point the rifle at it because I couldn't see it, and firing at nothing seemed likely to achieve nothing. Instead, I sat still and tried to accept that I was in a place where the conventional forms of safety didn't apply. The sound faded as dawn approached. I was alone again, but the solitude felt different now. The mountains had become a space where something was thinking, learning, preparing. I had become a problem it was trying to solve, and I didn't know what solution might look like. October 15th brought a frost that killed the remaining color in the valley and turned the high country white. Snow was coming early, the kind of snow that would close the trails and isolate the cabin completely. I had 3 weeks, maybe less, before the weather made leaving impossible and staying became a commitment to survival through a Montana winter. I knew by then that I couldn't stay. Not because of fear, though there was plenty of that, but because the presence was becoming more active, more bold. It was no longer content to observe from a distance. It had moved from watching to testing boundaries, and I understood that boundaries would continue to compress until I either left or was forced to confront something I had no genuine understanding of. I decided to leave on the 18th, when the weather forecast suggested a window of clear days. I packed what I could carry, filed my resignation, and tried not to think about what I was abandoning or what I was running toward. The night before I left, it came to the cabin, not violently, not with the intention to attack. It came and stood on the porch, and I could hear it breathing on the other side of the locked door. The sound of its breathing was wrong. Too deep, too deliberate, like it was learning what breathing should sound like by practicing. "I know you're there," I said to the door. The breathing stopped. For a moment there was only silence. "Can you understand me?" I asked. The breathing resumed. Then, in a voice that sounded like it was assembled from phonemes that didn't quite belong together, it spoke. "Understand. Learn. What you are." The words were barely words. The mouth that made them wasn't made for speech. But the meaning was clear. It wasn't trying to kill me. It was trying to know me, the way a person might try to know something they'd encountered that fascinated them. "Why?" I asked. "Hungry," it said. "Always hungry. For what you are, for what is inside you, for the knowing." I understood then. It wasn't hunger for food, though that might have been part of it. It was hunger for the knowledge of what it meant to be human, to move the way humans moved, to feel the way humans felt, to wear a face that could smile and mean something by that smile. It had been learning from me, from the hikers, from anyone it could encounter. It had been trying to bridge some gap between what it was and what we were, and that gap was a canyon it could never cross, no matter how carefully it studied our movements. "I'm leaving tomorrow," I said. "Can't leave," it said. "Part of you stays, part of you is here," and I realized it was right. Some part of me, the part that had come to the mountains to disappear into something larger, had succeeded in disappearing. It was here, in this place, in the attention of something that saw me clearly even when I couldn't see myself. I left at dawn, before the thing could do anything else, moving down the mountain trail as fast as careful footwork would allow. I didn't look back. I focused on each step, on the task of descending, on the mechanics of moving my body through space and toward safety. But I could feel it watching from the trees, patient and hungry and utterly committed to understanding what I was. I understood that it would still be watching, years later, when I was miles away and pretending to have moved on. Some part of me would always be in those mountains, visible to something that had learned how to see. I reached the main station by noon and filed my exit paperwork without explanation. Iris didn't ask questions, Paul didn't ask questions. They'd learned probably that some people fit in the mountains and some people didn't, and that trying to explain why rarely produced anything useful. I drove down out of Glacier as the sun was setting, watching the mountains fade in the rearview mirror. The snow was beginning to fall, starting what would become a winter that would bury the high passes and turn the cabin into a place where no human would go until spring. Something would stay there, though. Something would remain in the silence, learning patience, storing up the knowledge it had gathered. Someday it would perfect its imitation. Someday a hiker would encounter something on the trail that looked exactly right, moved exactly right, smiled correctly. And they would never know that they were looking into the face of something that had learned how to wear humanity the way we wear clothes. I still have nightmares about that final conversation at the door. I dream about the voice that wasn't a voice, the hunger that wasn't appetite, the yearning of something caught between what it was and what it wanted to be. I left the mountains, but the mountains never left me. And sometimes in cities far from any wilderness I feel that attention again, patient and focused and always, always hungry to know more. The cabin at Lake Saya still stands, as far as I know. I've never gone back. I've never had the courage to find out what lived there after I left. Whether it was still learning, whether it had finally achieved what it was reaching for. Some doors, once opened, shouldn't be walked through again. Some mountains keep their own counsel, and the best any of us can do is accept that there are places on this earth where the normal rules of existence don't quite apply. I accepted the ranger job because I wanted to disappear. I got what I wanted, just not in the way I'd imagined. Part of me never left those mountains, and part of what lived there will never leave me. We're bound together now, that thing and I. Connected by the moment I saw its wrong face and it saw my fear, and we understood each other completely. That was the real danger. Not the hunger, not the strangeness. The danger was the understanding that came from truly being seen by something that wanted desperately to be what I was. The danger was knowing that it might succeed. I accepted the position at Glacier National Park on a Thursday evening in March, sitting in my cramped apartment in Missoula while snow fell against the windows. The job posting had been straightforward: seasonal ranger, backcountry maintenance, emergency response. What it didn't say was that I'd be spending 6 months alone in a patrol cabin at the northern edge of the park, 40 miles from the nearest town, responsible for a territory that most people only saw from designated overlooks. My previous work as a ranger in the Bitterroot Valley had been competent but forgettable. I'd maintained trails, educated tourists, filed incident reports. But something was missing, something I couldn't articulate until I read about the position at Pagan Pass. The isolation appealed to me in a way that honest work rarely did. Not for the solitude exactly, but for the absence of judgment, of expectation. At 34 years old, I was ready to disappear into something larger than myself. The hiring process had been cursory. A phone interview with the district supervisor, Marcus Webb, who spoke in the measured cadence of a man who'd spent most of his adult life in the field. He'd asked about my experience with avalanche terrain, my competency in wildlife management, my ability to work without immediate backup. I'd answered truthfully, emphasizing my certifications and my comfort with isolation. What I didn't mention was why I needed to be alone so badly. The cabin itself was the real incentive. During the in-person interview, Marcus had driven me up the winding mountain road, through valleys where elk moved like ghosts between the trees. The cabin sat on the eastern shore of Lake Kintla, a body of water so remote that most rangers never patrolled that far into their territory. It was a structure from another era, built in 1957, maintained sporadically, equipped with basic necessities: a generator, a wood stove, a satellite phone for emergencies. No internet, no cellular service, no modern intrusions. The isolation was complete. Most rangers do this job for 2 or 3 seasons maximum, Marcus had said as we stood on the cabin's porch, looking out across the water toward the Continental Divide. The silence gets to people. Some find religion, some lose their minds. He'd smiled then, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. A few never come back when their rotation ends. I'd told him I wasn't concerned about the silence. I'd meant it. The move happened in late May when the mountain roads had cleared enough for supply trucks. My belongings fit into 2 large boxes, clothes suitable for a climate that shifted violently between seasons, technical climbing gear, maps, books, and a radio that picked up Park Service frequencies. Marcus helped me unload everything into the cabin's main room. The interior smelled of old wood and something mineral, like stone that had been sealed away from light for years. "You'll get supply runs every 6 weeks, Marcus explained, showing me the inventory system. "We leave things at the base station in Martin City and you pick them up on your rotation. Perishables you'll need to manage carefully. The solar panels charge the batteries, but they're unreliable in winter. Use the generator sparingly." He pointed out the emergency procedures, the locations of the first aid supplies, the protocol for contacting the main office. Everything was documented in a worn logbook that sat on the cabin's desk. Previous rangers had left notes about trail conditions, wildlife movements, occasional equipment failures. One entry from the previous season caught my attention: something moving through the area at night. Not bears, different pattern, not recording in photos. We'll investigate further. The entry was dated August 12th. The handwriting suggested it had been written in haste. "Who was here last?" I'd asked Marcus. "Ranger named Voss. Finished out his contract in September, then moved to Oregon. He was competent, thorough, didn't have the constitution for a second season though. Said the winters were too quiet, or maybe too loud, depending on how you looked at it." Marcus had shrugged. People interpret isolation differently. After Marcus left, driving his truck back down the mountain road, I spent the first evening exploring the cabin and the immediate surroundings. The structure was larger than I'd expected from the photographs, with 3 separate rooms: the main living space with the stove and kitchen area, a bedroom barely large enough for the narrow bed it contained, and a storage room where previous rangers had accumulated supplies, broken equipment, and boxes of documentation going back decades. The storage room was where I found the additional logbooks. Not the official ones used for incident reports, but personal journals that rangers had kept over the years. Most were brief, documenting weather patterns and observations about wildlife. But the older ones, dating back to the 1980s and 1990s, contained longer passages. One from 1987, written by a ranger named Caldwell, described something he called the pattern. He'd noticed tracks around the cabin that didn't match any known animal in the region, large prints, roughly circular, appearing and disappearing in ways that suggested the creature leaving them could move across rock without losing traction. The observations continued for months, growing increasingly focused. The final entry read, "I believe it's learning our schedules. It knows when I leave and when I return. I've set traps, but nothing catches. The photographs show nothing, even when I'm certain it passed through that location. It's not the terrain deceiving me. Something is different about this animal." Caldwell's tenure at the cabin had lasted 2 seasons. He'd transferred to a different station and never returned. Other journals contained similar accounts spread across decades, rangers noting strange vocalizations that didn't match any cataloged wildlife, tracks that appeared to move in ways that shouldn't be possible, a pattern of activity that seemed almost deliberate, almost responsive to human presence. I told myself they were documenting the unknown with the tools of observation and pattern recognition. The human mind, when isolated, sometimes creates coherence from randomness. A track in one location, connected through inference and assumption to a track discovered miles away, gradually forms a narrative of intentional movement. A nocturnal sound becomes more significant when you're alone and awake at 3 in the morning, listening to darkness. Still, I took the journals seriously enough to keep them accessible. By the end of my first week at the cabin, I'd read through most of them, noting the dates and locations of the strangest observations. Whatever had interested previous rangers, I wanted to understand it. Knowledge was the only defense against fear in a place this remote. The early summer passed without incident. I established routines, morning patrols of the accessible trails, maintenance on the bridges and water crossings, regular checks of the radio and emergency equipment. The landscape revealed itself gradually, the high alpine terrain becoming familiar in the way that solitude makes geography personal. I learned which valleys held elk herds, where the cutthroat trout grew large in glacier-fed streams, the specific quality of light that preceded afternoon thunderstorms rolling off the divide. The lake was beautiful in a way that suggested danger. Its water was so clear that you could see 30 feet down, but the clarity made the depth seem bottomless. The shoreline was rocky and broken, with few places suitable for walking. I established a habit of hiking to the far end of the lake each week, checking the trail markers and scanning the water for signs of erosion or damage. It was on one of these hikes, in late June, that I discovered the first evidence that something else was here. The tracks appeared on a stretch of scree at the north end of the lake, where loose rock made prints visible. They were large, irregular, and deeply impressed into the earth. The pattern suggested whatever had made them was moving with significant weight on a frame that distributed pressure unevenly. I photographed them with the digital camera I carried, noting the GPS coordinates. The tracks led from the water's edge, across the scree, and disappeared into the dense forest beyond. I followed them for perhaps half a mile, until the forest became too thick to navigate easily. The prints were increasingly clear, suggesting they were recent, possibly from the previous night. They showed evidence of purposeful movement toward the lake, then away. A creature approaching water, drinking, then retreating. When I returned to the cabin, I consulted the wildlife manuals and my own knowledge. The size and shape of the tracks didn't match any animal I could identify. They were too large for black bears, which were the primary predators in this region, too irregular for mountain lions. The depth of the impression suggested something substantially heavier than any known predator in Glacier, moving on legs that placed weight in distinct patterns. I added my own entry to the logbook that night, June 28th. Unknown tracks on North Shore, approximately 3 miles from cabin. Pattern suggests large animal, possibly unrecorded or misidentified species. Tracks move from water to forest, evidence of deliberate movement. Recommend investigation. I signed it with my initials and the date. Below it I didn't add what I was really thinking, that something in the wilderness recognized the lake as a resource, and something in my chest recognized that I was no longer the only conscious presence observing this place. July brought visitors to the park. Tourists who clustered at accessible viewpoints and lodges, never venturing more than a mile from their vehicles. My job during the summer months included some interaction with these people, though my primary responsibilities remained in the backcountry. I'd travel down to the main park service office roughly twice a month for supply runs and to file reports with Marcus. These trips to civilization became increasingly strange to me as the summer progressed. People seemed unreal after weeks alone in the mountains. Their conversations were shallow, their concerns absurdly petty. A couple complained that the lodge hadn't provided enough hot water for their shower. A man demanded to know why the gift shop was closed on Mondays. Meanwhile, I was thinking about the tracks, about the pattern they suggested, about the growing evidence that something significant was moving through this territory. The tracks continued to appear, not frequently but with enough regularity that I began to document them obsessively. I created a map showing the locations and dates of each discovery. The pattern that emerged was what the older rangers had noted. The creature seemed to move along specific routes, always approaching the lake from the forested areas to the east, drinking, then retreating. It never came close to the cabin directly, though it would pass no more than a few hundred yards away. The most disturbing observation came in mid-July. I discovered a deer carcass about 2 miles from the cabin, in a small clearing near the forest's edge. The animal was a mule deer doe, relatively fresh, with wounds that didn't match any predation pattern I knew. The flesh around the neck and shoulders had been shredded, but not in the way that a wolf or bear would kill. The wounds were too precise, almost surgical, and the position of the body suggested the animal had been killed in place, then partially consumed with methodical care. I took photographs and detailed measurements. The tracks around the carcass were the same irregular prints I'd documented elsewhere, though these were clearer, showing what might have been some kind of digit or claw structure. Whatever had killed this deer possessed intelligence. It had tracked the animal, brought it down with focused violence, and consumed it with purpose rather than frenzied hunger. When I reported this to Marcus during my next supply run, he listened with an expression I couldn't quite read. After I finished describing the location and the evidence, he was quiet for a long moment. "We've had reports," he finally said, "from other rangers in the northern regions, strange kills, predation patterns that don't match anything in the literature. Nothing we could substantiate enough to launch an official investigation, but enough that we've noticed. The park is vast. There are still species here that we don't fully understand." "This isn't a mountain lion," I said. "I've seen the evidence. I know what they kill and how they kill." "I'm not suggesting it is," Marcus replied. He pulled up something on his computer, a document labeled with a reference number I couldn't fully read. We had a ranger in the 1990s, Caldwell, who documented something similar. He called it an unknown predator. The Park Service investigated at the time, sent in wildlife specialists. They found nothing definitive, no remains suitable for analysis, no confirmed sightings. Eventually the case was closed and filed. "What did Caldwell think it was?" Marcus hesitated, choosing his words carefully. Caldwell believed it was something unclassified, something that existed in the park but had learned to avoid direct human contact. He spent 2 seasons trying to photograph it, to document definitive proof. He never succeeded. The frustration of it eventually got to him. He transferred to a different position and never returned to Glacier. And now the reports are sporadic. We have 13 rangers covering the entire park. Most of them never encounter evidence of anything unusual. You happen to be patrolling one of the remotest sections where sightings are most likely. Marcus closed the document. "Continue documenting. Take photographs if you can. File detailed reports. But be careful not to let this become an obsession. The wilderness does strange things to perception." That conversation should have warned me. Instead, it confirmed that I wasn't imagining things, that others had sensed the same presence, the same wrongness beneath the beautiful surface of this place. The summer heat faded into late July and August, the season when the mountains would normally become more accessible, the passes clearing fully. But that year, unusual weather patterns brought early snow to the higher elevations. It was rare for August, and the rangers speculated about what it meant for the fall and winter season ahead. Marcus mentioned that the historical weather patterns suggested we might be facing a particularly harsh winter, the kind that tested even experienced backcountry personnel. During the final week of August, I encountered direct evidence of the creature. I was conducting a trail survey near the lake's northern inlet, where a small stream fed into the water. The ground was soft there, boggy in places, perfect for preserving tracks. I found an entire sequence of prints, dozens of them, clustered in a path that led directly to the water. And for the first time, I could see detail in the prints that suggested something approximating a hand or foot structure with multiple digits. I spent hours photographing every print, documenting the size and depth. The creature was large, perhaps 7 or 8 feet long based on the stride length. The weight suggested by the impressions indicated something approaching 600 or 700 pounds. And the track pattern suggested a form of locomotion that wasn't quite quadrupedal, but wasn't bipedal either. Something that shifted between gaits, that could move on multiple limbs but occasionally used its rear legs with more emphasis, as if it had the capability for upright posture. As I was photographing the final prints, something caught my attention in the forest edge nearby. Movement, subtle, behind the screen of evergreen boughs. Not the movement of wind and branches, but something deliberate, something watching. I froze, my hand instinctively moving to the bear spray at my belt. The movement ceased. The forest returned to stillness, but the sensation of observation lingered. I returned to the cabin and reported everything to Marcus through the satellite phone. His response was more guarded than before. "You need to be careful," he said. "Whatever this thing is, it's maintaining distance. That suggests intelligence or at least behavioral learning. As long as you don't pose a direct threat, it shouldn't approach the cabin. But don't test that assumption." "What is it?" I asked directly. "What do you think this creature is?" There was a long pause before Marcus answered. "I think it's something that exists in the places we've decided are wilderness. Something that was here before we started assigning ranger stations and drawing park boundaries. What it is specifically, I don't think we have the framework to understand that yet." After the call ended, I sat in the darkness of the cabin, listening to the sounds outside, the wind through the trees, the occasional call of a loon from across the lake. And underneath those familiar sounds, something else, a presence that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin, attentive, curious, waiting. September arrived with clarity and cold. The summer tourists vanished from the park, and the season took on a different character entirely. The light changed, becoming slanting and autumnal, the quality of afternoon visibility extending deeper into the shadows of the forest. My supply runs became less frequent as the seasonal staff diminished. By mid-September, only a skeleton crew of year-round rangers remained at the main offices, and my contact with civilization reduced to brief radio check-ins and sporadic satellite phone calls. I had decided to extend my contract through the winter. The Park Service had seemed surprised by the decision, but Marcus hadn't argued against it. Perhaps he understood that I needed to stay, that leaving would feel like abandonment, like surrendering the knowledge I was accumulating to the silence of not knowing. Winter at the cabin would be brutal. The snowfall potentially reaching 20 or more feet, the temperature dropping to -30 or colder. But it would also provide clarity about what shared this place with me. The creature's activity increased as fall deepened. The frequency of track discoveries escalated from weekly to nearly daily. The prints appeared on the trails I maintained, sometimes crossing my own footprints in ways that suggested the creature was shadowing my movements, approaching the same locations after I'd passed through. It was testing me, or perhaps testing itself, gauging the distance it could approach while still maintaining its distance. In early October, I discovered something that fundamentally changed my understanding of the situation. I found clothing near the lakeshore, partially buried under a pile of branches and debris. The garments were old, the fabric degraded and discolored, but recognizable as human. A flannel shirt, now mostly rotted away, and what appeared to be hiking pants, torn and stained with substances that could have been blood or rust or decomposition fluid from months or years of exposure to the earth. I photographed everything before touching it. The burial pattern suggested deliberate placement, as if someone had arranged the clothing specifically to hide it, or perhaps to preserve it. There was no body, no indication of remains, but the psychological weight of finding evidence that a human had been here, that perhaps had been killed or had died, changed the narrative entirely. I reported the discovery to Marcus in my next communication, maintaining a calm tone despite the sensation of my reality fragmenting. He asked for precise GPS coordinates and promised to send a team to investigate. 3 days later, a pair of Park Service rangers and a law enforcement officer arrived by helicopter. They spent 6 hours examining the site, photographing, collecting samples. The officer, a woman named Garrett, whose expression suggested she'd encountered worse than deteriorated clothing, asked me extensive questions about the location, the timing of my discovery, my theories about how the items came to be there. I showed them my documentation, all the photographs and mapped locations of the creature's tracks. I described the pattern of movement, the kill site I'd discovered, the general behavior. The rangers listened with the professional skepticism of people trained to treat extraordinary claims with appropriate doubt. But I could see something shift in their expressions as the evidence accumulated. "This pattern suggests a predator," one of them, a ranger named Prosser, said. "Something large, intelligent, hunting in a specific territory. The clothing suggests that either this creature has encountered humans before, or it's encountered the result of human death. Or," the officer Garrett added quietly, "it's killed a human before." They removed the clothing for analysis and left the same day. Marcus called that evening. "The lab work will take time," he explained, "but the clothing is older than you might expect. Early estimates suggest the items date to the 1970s or 1980s. We've cross-referenced missing persons reports for that period." There were 3 hikers reported missing from this general area in 1979. The names are Joseph Reeves, a wildlife photographer who entered the park alone and never exited; Catherine Ross, a botany student on a research expedition; and an unnamed hiker whose body was never recovered. The clothing you found might belong to one of them. The reality of it settled into me like cold water. Whatever was living in this territory with me had been doing so for decades. Whatever had killed or had become the final resting place of those missing people was still here, still moving along familiar routes, still observing the boundaries between its space and ours. October progressed toward November, and the weather shifted dramatically. The first major snowstorm arrived in the last week of October, dumping nearly 2 feet in a single day and blocking the mountain passes. The supply run scheduled for the following week was postponed indefinitely. I was effectively committed to the cabin for the entire winter. No turning back, no emergency extraction unless the situation became dire enough to justify a helicopter in dangerous conditions. The creature's behavior changed with the snow. The tracks became more frequent, bolder. I documented prints no more than 100 yards from the cabin, the closest approach yet. There was a terrible intimacy to it, the sense that whatever this thing was, it was acknowledging me, drawing closer to the boundary of my space while maintaining just enough distance to avoid direct confrontation. In the second week of November, I experienced my first direct sighting. I was returning to the cabin in late afternoon, after conducting a survey of the Western Trail system. The light was failing, the shadows growing long and blue across the snow. I was perhaps a quarter mile from the cabin, walking along the lake shore, when I saw movement across the frozen surface. A shape, massive and dark against the white ice, moving with a strange undulating gait. Even at the distance of several hundred yards I could perceive its size, its wrongness. It moved like nothing I had ever witnessed. Not quite upright, not quite quadrupedal, something that shifted between gaits as it traversed the ice. I stopped walking. The creature became aware of my observation and paused. For perhaps 30 seconds we were both still, watching across the distance. I could make out details now, the massive shoulders, the shape of its head, something that might have been it turning its gaze toward me. The facial structure wasn't quite visible at this distance, but something in the outline suggested intelligence, consciousness, recognition. Then it continued its movement, unhurried, crossing the remainder of the ice and disappearing into the forest on the far side of the lake. I was left standing alone in the growing darkness, my heart rate elevated, my mind struggling to process what I had witnessed. That night, I wrote in my personal journal, not the official logbook, "I have seen it." The size is approximately as estimated from the tracks. The gait suggests a creature that exists between forms, capable of moving through forest and across open terrain with equal ease. It did not approach, it did not appear aggressive, but the intelligence in the moment of observation was undeniable. This is not a bear or any known predator. This is something else, something that has learned to share this territory with human presence. The question now is whether sharing the space will be enough, or whether proximity will eventually demand a confrontation. The winter deepened, the snow accumulated, the cabin became isolated in a way that transcended mere geography. The world outside was hostile, the passes blocked, the park essentially shut down until spring. I had supplies for several months, the generator functioned adequately, and the radio connection remained stable. But I was aware that I was now entirely dependent on my own competence and the assumption that the creature would continue to maintain its distance. December arrived with another massive storm, wind speeds reaching near blizzard conditions that kept me confined to the cabin for 3 consecutive days. During that confinement, with nothing to do but exist in the small space and listen to the wind outside, I became aware of a change in the creature's behavior. It was circling the cabin. I could hear it, the heavy movements in the snow, the occasional impact against the walls, the sound of something large negotiating the terrain surrounding the building. It didn't seem aggressive, more exploratory, a thorough investigation of the structure and its boundaries. I remained inside, maintaining quiet, unsure what else to do. The windows were small and elevated, making visual confirmation of its location difficult, but I could track its movements by sound, the way the wind carried the noise of its locomotion around the cabin's perimeter. In the afternoon of the 3rd day of the storm, it made contact with the door. The impact was deliberate, not a battering ram blow, but something that communicated intention. I was sitting at the cabin table reviewing supply inventories when the sound came, a heavy thud against the wooden door, unmistakable in its meaning. Something outside wanted to enter, or was testing whether it could. I moved to the door but didn't open it. The heavy interior latch was secure. Through a crack in the door frame, I could see nothing but swirling snow. For several minutes there was no sound, then another impact, this time against the window frame. Testing, probing, trying to assess the structure. The glass held, the frame didn't yield, then it vocalized. The sound came from directly outside the door, a sound unlike anything in nature that I recognized. It was not a roar, not a howl, but something between them, a deep resonant call that seemed to vibrate through the cabin's walls. The sound carried intelligence, it carried intention. It was not an animal sound, it was communication. I responded by moving back from the door and retrieving the bear spray from my emergency kit. It was a useless gesture, a psychological comfort more than a practical defense. The spray would do nothing to a creature this large. I kept it anyway, holding it like a talisman while the wind continued to howl and the creature remained outside. The contact continued intermittently through the night. Sounds of movement, of heavy bodies settling in the snow surrounding the cabin, of vocalizations that seemed to be calling back and forth, multiple creatures perhaps, though I could never confirm the exact number. By morning, when the storm finally began to subside, I was exhausted and shaking, not from cold but from sustained tension and the awareness that the barrier between me and the wilderness was far more fragile than I had previously understood. When dawn came, I cautiously opened the door. The snow around the cabin was heavily tracked, the impressions of large bodies visible in every direction. The pattern suggested at least 2 creatures, possibly more, circling the cabin throughout the night. They had done no damage to the structure, had made no serious attempt at entry. It was reconnaissance, communication, establishment of territory and boundary. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin. I checked all windows and locks, ensured the door frame was secure, and arranged supplies in ways that would give me access to the radio and phone if I needed to make an emergency call. But I also sat in the cabin and thought about what was happening. The creatures were not attacking. They were establishing a relationship, defining the terms of our coexistence. They were saying, "This is our territory, but we will tolerate your presence as long as you remain aware of that fact." That evening, I called Marcus. "There's been direct contact," I reported, keeping my voice level. 2 or more creatures circled the cabin during the last storm. They vocalized, made physical contact with the structure, but did not attempt to breach it. "I'm secure, supplies are adequate, but I need to report the escalation." There was a long silence before Marcus responded. "You're certain about what you're reporting? 2 creatures, vocalization, deliberate contact?" "Absolutely certain." "Okay, listen to me. The winter weather is severe. We can't get personnel out there to you. We can't extract you safely until the spring passes are clear. Do you understand that?" "I understand. You need to maintain presence in the cabin. The creatures have established that they don't consider you a prey animal, or they would have acted by now. Your advantage is that your space is defensible. The cabin becomes your territory, recognized as separate from their hunting grounds. You establish routine, you respond to any further contact with confidence, and you survive until the spring. And if they decide the boundary is negotiable, then you defend. You have weapons in the cabin. There's a rifle in the storage room, ammunition in the cabinet. But I don't think it will come to that. These creatures have learned to avoid humans for decades, possibly centuries. Their interest in you is curiosity, not predation." After the call ended, I retrieved the rifle from where it had been stored, still cased and maintained. I checked the ammunition, test-fired it in the storage room away from windows, and confirmed that it was functional. Ownership of the weapon changed something about my psychology. I was no longer simply surviving in the wilderness. I was now prepared for confrontation. But no confrontation came. Instead, the creatures established a routine. December transformed into January, and the winter deepened into something almost otherworldly in its intensity. The temperature dropped to -20, -30, the kind of cold that makes exposed flesh numb in minutes. Snow accumulated at a rate that required regular clearing from the cabin's doorway. I fell into patterns of maintenance and observation, clearing the roof of accumulated snow to prevent collapse, keeping the generator running, monitoring the radio for any news from the outside world. The creatures became background to this routine. I realized they were hunting through the territory, occasionally passing near enough that I could hear them vocalize. The vocalization seemed communicative, calls back and forth across the forest, patterns that suggested coordination and hunting strategy. I documented the sounds, the timing of activity, the apparent responses. The creatures were operating as a social unit, probably a family group, Adults and younger animals, perhaps, existing in a structure similar to wolf packs or bear families. In late January, one of them returned to the cabin. I heard it approach in the early evening, moving slowly through the snow toward the structure. This time, rather than circling, it came directly to the window and simply remained there. I could see its outline in the darkness beyond the glass, a massive shape, solid and present. Without panic, I moved to the window and, using a small flashlight, illuminated the glass from inside. What I saw changed everything I thought I understood about fear and recognition. The creature's face was turned toward the window, oriented toward my light, and in that moment of illumination, I perceived something that I had been unable to articulate before. This was not an animal that happened to possess intelligence. This was a conscious being, observing me with the same intensity that I was observing it. The face was broad, the structure of the skull distinct from any known primate or ape. The eyes were dark, reflecting the light back at me with an intensity that suggested complete awareness. We regarded each other for perhaps 2 minutes. Then, slowly, the creature turned and walked away from the cabin. But something had shifted between us. The simple act of looking directly at each other had established something beyond territory or threat assessment. It was recognition between consciousnesses. I sat in darkness for hours after that, processing the encounter. The creature had not appeared as a beast or a predator in that moment. It had appeared as something self-aware, something with its own internal life and consciousness. And if that was true, then everything I had been thinking about this territory and my presence within it needed reconsideration. Over the following weeks, as the deepest part of winter passed and late February approached, I developed a different understanding of the situation. The creatures were not attacking because they did not view me as either prey or threat. I was simply another presence in the territory, another consciousness existing parallel to theirs. The vocalizations I heard at night were not calls of aggression but communication, sharing of information about the territory, location of food sources, movement patterns. When I discovered evidence of another kill, this time an elk that had been brought down at the edge of the valley, I understood the pattern more clearly. The creature was hunting to survive, following the same imperatives that every predator in the mountains followed. The difference was that it was doing so with intelligence and awareness that transcended simple instinct. One night in late February, during one of the warming periods that occasionally punctuated the deep winter, I heard multiple creatures vocalizing in complex patterns. The sounds went back and forth across the forest, organizing, coordinating, establishing something. They seemed to be gathering, preparing for something. The communication patterns suggesting heightened urgency. At dawn, I discovered why. A group of hikers, a party of 4, had entered the park through the western passes despite the winter conditions. They were attempting to reach the summit of one of the peaks, unprepared for the severity of the weather, lacking the experience for high-altitude winter travel. The radio traffic was immediate and panicked as rangers from the main office received the emergency call. The group was exposed, hypothermic setting in, their supplies insufficient. A rescue helicopter was being prepared, but the weather was marginal for flight operations. I understood then what the creatures had been communicating about. They had sensed the approach of humans, the disturbance in the territorial patterns that they understood in ways I was only beginning to perceive. They were aware of the danger the humans represented, not from aggression, but from disruption. From bringing the external world into their isolated existence. The rescue helicopter launched in the early afternoon. I heard it approaching from the south, its rotors cutting through the mountain air, and I heard the creatures vocalize in response, a series of calls that seemed almost mournful, an acknowledgement of intrusion, of the boundary between their world and ours becoming permeable. The rescue succeeded. The hikers were extracted to safety, their photos probably showing smiling faces to cameras in the lowland communities. Their story reduced to a near disaster survived. They would return home, tell their adventure to friends, never understanding what had really transpired in those mountains. But something shifted in the territory after the rescue. The creature's activity patterns changed. The vocalizations became less frequent. The approaches to the cabin ceased. I understood, with the clarity that comes from living within a place and learning its rhythms, that they had adjusted their understanding of the boundaries. The presence of humans beyond myself, the intrusion of external rescue operations had clarified the limits of their territory. They were retreating deeper, establishing distance that would make conflict unnecessary. By mid-March, as the snow began its transition towards spring, the creatures had become peripheral presences. I would occasionally find fresh tracks, evidence of their continued hunting and movement. But the direct contact had ended. We had established the terms of our coexistence, and those terms had been accepted by both parties. When Marcus arrived by snowmobile in late March to assess the cabin for continued occupation, I found myself unable to fully describe what had transpired. How could I explain that I had lived for 6 months in proximity to a conscious intelligence that existed in that territory, that we had negotiated the terms of our shared space through observation and patience, that the boundary between civilization and wilderness had become both more distinct and more permeable? Instead, I provided the official reports, the track documentation, the kills observed, the evidence of predation, the clothing recovered and analyzed by Park Service forensics. The conclusion was that a large unknown predator existed in the territory, that it posed minimal direct threat to human presence, and that observation and documentation should continue. But what I knew, and what Marcus perhaps understood beneath the official language, was that something else had transpired. Some kind of contact had been made with a consciousness that existed outside the frameworks of official knowledge, that had learned to tolerate human presence because it recognized that not all humans were a threat. As I prepared to leave the cabin, Marcus offered me a chance to return the following season. I declined. "Why?" he asked, and I could hear genuine curiosity beneath the question. "Because what I learned there can't be preserved in official reports," I said. Naming it, trying to classify it, studying it further, that would destroy what was established during the winter. Some knowledge requires discretion. Some understanding is only possible if you accept that it will never be fully documented. Marcus nodded slowly, as if he had expected this answer. The drive down the mountain road was strange, the transition from isolation back into human civilization almost physically painful. Within a week, I had left the Park Service entirely. I found work in Missoula, unremarkable employment that allowed me to exist in the margins of normal society. But I remained aware, watching the mountains to the north, knowing that somewhere in that wilderness consciousnesses were moving through territory with intelligence and purpose, existing in a place where humans were only temporary visitors, where the older rules still applied. Sometimes, on cold nights, I stand outside and listen to the wind, and sometimes I think I can hear the distant echo of something deeper than wind, something calling across the darkness of uninhabited spaces, communicating across the boundary between what is known and what remains, mercifully unknown. The cabin at Piegan Pass still stands. The Park Service has continued the ranger rotation, though the seasonal positions remain difficult to fill, and something continues to move through that territory, learning, adapting, maintaining the boundaries between its existence and the world of humans who think the wilderness belongs to them. But those of us who have truly lived in those mountains know better. The wilderness doesn't belong to anyone. It tolerates presence, it allows temporary habitation, and it reserves the right to define what can exist within its boundaries and what must eventually return to the towns and cities from which it came. That is the knowledge I maintained silence about, the understanding I carried back from the winter. Some truths are too important to share.